1 week later, Lloyd crossed the eastern mountain range and arrived at the village of the Sand and Steel tribe of wild orcs alongside Javier and Arush. The moment they entered the village, Arush burst forward while calling out to his father with excitement. In response, his father, Akush, roared just as loudly and charged toward his son without hesitation. The ground trembled violently beneath their massive bodies. Their muscular legs, as thick as lampposts, pounded against the earth hard enough to shake the surroundings. Watching the enormous orc sprint forward at terrifying speed, Lloyd was reminded of the wild boars of Ural Mountain. Neither of them slowed down before crashing directly into each other. The impact alone stirred up a small sandstorm around their bodies. Deep within, Lloyd shuddered at the absurd force behind what had merely been a father-son embrace. If he had been caught between them, he was certain he would have been reduced to pieces instantly. Yet at the same time, a grin slowly spread across his face. Inside, calculations raced through his mind. If he could secure 120 workers with bodies like those, productivity on the construction site would rise hundreds of times over. At that moment, Arush proudly lifted the giant head of the queen ant above his own head and declared his achievement before the tribe. Akush's eyes widened with overwhelming pride as he praised his son enthusiastically. In celebration of the accomplishment, he immediately announced an especially grueling leg workout for the day. The reaction from the other orcs was no different. Hundreds of them erupted into cheers and chaos as excitement spread throughout the village. Before long, Lloyd witnessed several orcs lifting a massive statue and throwing it onto their shoulders as if it weighed nothing. Yet the orcs treated every single item as workout equipment. Some grabbed pillars plated with gold and casually performed squats with them, and for a moment, Lloyd could only stare in utter disbelief. Then realization struck him like lightning. Internally, he screamed in outrage at the horrifying waste unfolding before his eyes. Those priceless objects had probably been pillaged from somewhere, yet the orcs viewed them as nothing more than exercise tools. It was the perfect moment. Lloyd quietly steadied himself and revealed the true purpose behind his visit. However, Akush firmly refused the request, apologizing to Lloyd while making it clear that the matter could not be granted. Lloyd's face immediately fell in disbelief. He could not understand why the orcs had suddenly changed their minds again. Maintaining his composure, he respectfully addressed Akush, the great chief of the Sand and Steel tribe, and requested an explanation for the refusal. In response, Akush flexed his enormous muscles proudly before explaining the tribe's circumstances. The orcs consumed tremendous amounts of meat to maintain their physiques, and to sustain those muscles, hunting parties were sent out every single day in 3 separate shifts. According to Akush, failing to do so would result in muscle loss, and muscle loss was something the tribe considered equivalent to destruction itself. Because of that, they could not afford to reduce the number of warriors assigned to hunting. Lloyd paused in disbelief and asked whether they truly hunted every single day. Akush confirmed it without hesitation. Meat spoiled after a single day, and consuming spoiled meat would supposedly lead to muscle loss. At that moment, Lloyd realized that everything in this tribe revolved around muscles. Javier calmly remarked that protein and muscles were essentially the meaning of life for the orcs, then suggested they abandon the idea altogether. However, Lloyd sank into thought for a brief moment before speaking again. He proposed another possibility. If the tribe possessed a way to preserve meat for several days without spoilage, they would no longer need to hunt 3 times a day. In that case, they could lend their worker orcs for construction work instead. Akush admitted that such a solution would indeed resolve the issue. Although the tribe wished to repay Lloyd for helping Arush, they simply could not risk suffering muscle loss. That was when Lloyd confidently declared that such preservation was entirely possible. He boldly claimed that he could make meat remain fresh for days without spoiling. The moment those words left his mouth, calculations rapidly unfolded inside Lloyd's head. If things worked out, he would gain recognition from the orcs as a true warrior, secure the labor of the worker orcs, and even sign a profitable construction contract with Akush in the process. By the time the calculations were complete, a mischievous smile slowly crept across Lloyd's face. Later, as the wilderness wind swept across the plains, Lloyd explained the details of his plan to Javier. The contract he had arranged with the tribe chief would allow him to obtain both the worker orcs and the tribe's treasures as payment. Javier carefully examined the contract. According to its contents, the contractor would construct something called a Seok Bingo for the client, while receiving the tribe's so-called fitness tools as compensation. In exchange, ordinary stone workout equipment would be provided to replace them. The unfamiliar word immediately caught Javier's attention. Once again, Lloyd had introduced something Javier had never seen or even heard of before. Lloyd explained that the royal palace used mages with ice magic to preserve food, but the Seok Bingo was a structure capable of achieving the same result without relying on magic at all. Javier narrowed his eyes suspiciously and questioned where Lloyd had learned something like that. Lloyd casually brushed the question aside by claiming he had learned it through a student society. Javier looked even more confused at the strange answer. Rather than elaborate further, Lloyd impatiently complained about how Javier seemed unfamiliar with far too many things. He quickly moved on and explained that constructing the Seok Bingo required granite, an extremely durable type of rock. After examining it, Javier remarked that the stone did not appear easy to break apart. Lloyd immediately agreed. The granite was incredibly hard. Quietly, thoughts began turning within Lloyd's mind. There was no dynamite in this world, but there was something else that could replace it. Lloyd slowly turned toward Javier while wearing a sly grin. Deep down, he delighted at the thought that they already possessed a human-shaped stick of dynamite. The moment Javier saw that expression, realization dawned on him instantly. He had seen that look before. Lloyd was planning to use him again. A certain crucial episode from the novel Night of Blood and Iron suddenly surfaced in Lloyd's memory. His thoughts drifted back to the incident at Namaran's Wall, a city imprisoned within a powerful and sinister magical barrier. Thousands of refugees had been trapped inside, slowly having their mana drained away while Javier stood powerless before them. By that point in the story, Javier had already reached the level of a sword master and could form up to 4 mana circles. Yet even with that strength, he had been unable to stop the tragedy unfolding before his eyes. Desperate to save the refugees even at the cost of his own life, Javier had unconsciously created a new technique during that crisis. 1 mana circle had been left behind to protect the main mana heart, while the remaining 3 circles had been violently smashed together. The resulting collision had unleashed an unimaginable explosion of mana that instantly shattered Namaran's wall. From that day onward, the Mana Blast became one of the legendary signature techniques of the Night of Blood and Iron, standing beside the famed Azrahan Core technique. With that memory fresh in his mind, Lloyd casually suggested that Javier attempt something similar. Javier immediately stared at him suspiciously and honestly demanded to know how Lloyd kept knowing things like this. Without missing a beat, Lloyd shamelessly insisted that the idea had merely appeared in his head. He even pointed at his own face and asked whether his eyes truly resembled those of a liar. Javier answered without hesitation that they absolutely looked like the eyes of an extremely annoying liar. Lloyd reacted with mock offense while teasing Javier about having a surprisingly dark heart. Then a scheming smile slowly spread across Lloyd's face as he urged Javier to try it anyway. The thought of Javier's swordsmanship evolving sounded incredibly exciting to him. Javier immediately saw through the act and bluntly pointed out that Lloyd was clearly trying to gain something from him again. Lloyd instantly denied everything with exaggerated innocence, insisting that he only wanted what was best for Javier as well, making it a perfect win-win situation. After a long sigh, Javier finally relented. If such a technique was truly possible, it would benefit him too. With that reasoning, he decided to attempt it. Javier slowly drew his longsword. 1 mana circle remained to protect the mana heart while the other 2 were mobilized. Then, with a powerful strike, Javier slammed the sword into the granite. The blade pierced straight through the rock. At the exact moment Lloyd shouted for him to release it, a brilliant flash erupted from the sword and spread violently through the granite. An instant later, the entire rock exploded apart like dynamite. Dust and debris blasted outward in every direction, forcing Lloyd backward as the shockwave tore through the area. Even Lloyd himself was stunned. Javier had succeeded on the very first attempt. As the dust slowly settled, Javier's silhouette emerged and approached Lloyd. However, the moment his figure became fully visible, Lloyd noticed that Javier's clothes had been completely torn apart by the explosion, while dust covered his entire body. Javier calmly asked whether Lloyd had anticipated even this outcome. Lloyd immediately shook his head with exaggerated innocence and apologized repeatedly while insisting he truly had not expected it at all. Javier let out another tired sigh. Regardless of everything, Lloyd's strange idea had once again proven correct. Since that was the case, Javier dryly asked whether it was now time for him to begin doing labor work. At that moment, the system notification appeared before Lloyd. Javier felt grateful for being taught the new technique, causing Lloyd's approval rating to increase by 3 points. While brushing dust from his body, Javier reminded Lloyd that he was a knight who trained with the sword to protect his master, not to use swordsmanship for construction work. Lloyd, however, completely ignored the complaint and shamelessly accepted gratitude that had never been given. Javier immediately snapped back in frustration, firmly clarifying that he had not been thanking him whatsoever. After that, construction advanced at a terrifying speed. Javier sliced massive blocks of granite apart with his sword, while Podong transported them across the site. The orcs soon became fully invested in the work as well. They barked at the workers that lifting improperly would ruin their backs before aggressively pushing humans aside to demonstrate the correct method themselves. Lloyd had never even requested their help, yet the orcs threw themselves into construction work voluntarily, like exercise addicts discovering a new training routine. To them, the entire construction site had become the ultimate workout ground. The orcs excitedly roared about how incredible the exercise felt while praising the brutal intensity of the labor with pure joy. Lloyd leaned back while observing the construction site with satisfaction. At the current pace, the work would finish nearly 5 times faster than originally planned. All that remained was securing ice and insulation materials. Remembering the workers he had sent out earlier, Lloyd turned toward Javier and asked how long it had been since the 5 men departed to retrieve the insulation. Javier calmly answered that exactly 3 weeks had passed. The response immediately made Lloyd uneasy. 3 weeks was more than enough time for a round trip. Javier quietly stated the 2 most likely possibilities. Either the workers had become lazy and were deliberately taking their time, or something unfortunate had happened to them. The moment those words were spoken, Lloyd stood up without hesitation and declared they would go search for them personally. Javier immediately tried to stop him, insisting that he should handle the mission alone. Since they had no idea what danger might have befallen the men, the heir of the estate should not recklessly place himself in danger. Lloyd cut him off before he could finish. He firmly reminded Javier that he was the one in charge, and because of that, every worker under him was his responsibility. After hearing that, Javier quietly nodded and agreed to accompany him. The 2 immediately departed and began traversing the rough terrain in search of the missing men. 4 days later, Lloyd's growing sense of dread became reality. Javier discovered a torn glove and silently handed it to Lloyd. The moment Lloyd saw it, his expression hardened. Inside, he recognized it immediately as one of the specially made gloves prepared for his workers. Nearby lay scattered pieces of straw meant for insulation. Then Javier suddenly called out to him from ahead. Standing near the edge of a cliffside, Javier pointed toward the direction of Progya Gorge and explained that something there felt unnatural. The flow of mana in the area seemed distorted, though the sensation itself was extremely faint. The moment Lloyd heard the name Progya Gorge, his mind froze. There had definitely been an episode about that place in Night of Blood and Iron. As the memory resurfaced, Lloyd's expression instantly darkened. Realization struck him with terrifying force. Without wasting another second, he urgently ordered Javier to move immediately, insisting there was no time left to lose. Javier quickly noticed the fear in Lloyd's voice and asked whether he suspected something. Lloyd answered with visible panic that their men might already be dead. Those words stunned Javier completely. The 2 immediately rushed through the valley while following the trail left behind. After traveling deeper into the area, they discovered strands of husks scattered across the ground. But the trail did not end there. It continued all the way toward a cave. The moment Lloyd saw it, recognition surfaced instantly. It was Lupellin's dungeon. Within, Lloyd recalled the episode from the novel where Javier dealt with this place during the early stages of the story. It had been the secret hideout of the Dark Sorcerer Lupellin. At that moment, fury quietly boiled inside him. Deep down, he burned with rage at the thought that someone had dared touch what he considered his property, his workers. To Lloyd, it felt like a direct violation of his property rights, and even the death penalty seemed too generous for the culprit. Before Lloyd could think further, Javier stepped forward and instructed him to stay behind. Lloyd immediately tried to stop him, but before he could react in time, Javier stepped directly onto the dungeon entrance. The instant his foot touched the ground, a magical circle activated beneath him. Lloyd's eyes widened. Without hesitation, he grabbed Javier by the back of the collar and violently yanked him backward. A split second later, the magic circle exploded. Flames burst outward from the entrance as debris scattered violently through the air. Javier immediately recognized the mechanism after the explosion. It was a magical booby trap. Lloyd instantly lashed out at him in frustration, questioning whether he was truly a knight when he could walk into a place like this without considering the possibility of traps. Privately, Lloyd recalled how the original story had unfolded. In the novel, Javier had been caught by the very first trap and entered Lupellin's dungeon covered in wounds. But this time would be different. Their Javier was not getting caught so easily. Quickly calming himself, Lloyd explained what Javier had already sensed earlier. The flow of mana in the area had felt unnatural from the start, and Lloyd told him to focus more carefully on that sensation. Normally, mana maintained an even concentration throughout the air. Wherever a trap had been planted, however, the mana gathered into an unnatural cluster. Following Lloyd's advice, Javier sharpened his senses again. This time, he felt it clearly. After raising his head slightly, he quietly indicated the direction ahead and began moving deeper into the cave. Lloyd immediately followed behind him with cheerful confidence, praising Javier for catching on so quickly. Meanwhile, suspicion continued growing within Javier's mind. Lloyd always dodged direct answers with ridiculous lies, yet the evidence before him had become impossible to ignore. Lloyd Frontera somehow knew exactly what was happening around them and even seemed aware of events that had not occurred yet. Still, Javier could sense no remarkable mana or mysterious energy from him whatsoever, but he forced himself to stop dwelling on it. Right now, rescuing the missing soldiers mattered far more. With that resolve, Javier pressed onward while Lloyd stayed close behind him. Far deeper inside the cave, a Dark Sorcerer quietly sat reading a book. Moments later, his eyes shifted toward the entrance as he sensed a disturbance nearby. One of the traps had activated. Intruders. The Sorcerer assumed they had come searching for the men he abducted earlier. It no longer mattered to him whether those workers lived or died. His preparations were finally complete, and he only hoped that this experiment would succeed where the others had failed. Inside a sealed chamber nearby, Lloyd's workers remained tied up with ropes, trembling in terror. The Sorcerer casually grabbed one of the men by the hair and dragged him out into the center of the room. The worker desperately begged and pleaded for his life, but the Sorcerer remained completely indifferent as he threw him into a divine circle prepared for the ritual. Then the Sorcerer slowly picked up a sickle while reviewing the conditions with satisfaction. A pentacle connected to the underworld, a sickle soaked in blood for 100 days, and a young human sacrifice. Everything was perfect. The terrified worker screamed in horror as the Sorcerer raised the sickle overhead. But just as the blade began descending, a loud voice suddenly echoed through the chamber and stopped him cold. Lloyd had arrived alongside Javier. Without hesitation, Lloyd warned the Sorcerer not to touch what belonged to him and threatened to kill him if he did. The Sorcerer stared at them in utter disbelief. There had been hundreds of traps protecting this dungeon. He could not understand how the two had made it all the way inside. Immediately, he formed a hand sign toward them. At once, another trap activated. With a violent crash, a thick metal wall dropped from the ceiling and sealed off the path ahead of Lloyd and Javier. A second wall immediately slammed down behind them, trapping them completely inside the enclosed space. Then a hissing sound spread through the chamber as sweet-smelling gas poured down from above. The air rapidly filled with a powerful sleeping gas potent enough to knock out even an elephant. Watching the gas spread, the Sorcerer secretly grinned to himself. Now he had 2 additional sacrifices for the ritual. Yet despite the deadly trap, Lloyd and Javier remained completely calm. Lloyd casually picked up his shovel and activated the Energizer option of the Astrahan core technique. The moment the effect kicked in, Lloyd began digging furiously. His shovel moved in a chaotic frenzy, almost like a bizarre dance performance. Every swing carved away massive amounts of earth, and within moments, a deep pit rapidly formed beneath him. Inside, Lloyd grinned confidently. He did not even need the full 10 minutes granted by Energizer. Unlike back in the ant cave, he still had plenty of stamina left. And Javier, after exhausting every insomnia remedy imaginable over the years, had practically developed immunity to every kind of sleeping medication in existence. As long as Lloyd kept digging like this, escaping the trap would be easy. Meanwhile, Javier quietly remained behind him. As he watched Lloyd furiously burrow through the earth with his shovel, an unexpected thought crossed his mind. Lloyd resembled a mole cricket digging through the ground. Javier silently decided to remember this sight forever. The next time Lloyd mocked him, he intended to retaliate with this image without mercy. Several minutes later, Lloyd finally called him over. He instructed Javier to stab sideways and unleash a mana blast the moment he saw an opening. After confirming Lloyd had moved to a safe distance, Javier slowly raised his sword. The mana within him surged violently. Starting from the mana heart, the shockwave spread through the pathways of his body, growing stronger as it traveled through his muscles and flowed past his elbow, wrist, and fingertips before finally gathering at the sword's tip. Then it exploded outward. A deafening roar shook the chamber. The mana blast erupted vertically, obliterating the earth above them as though it had vanished into thin air. In an instant, a massive 30-foot tunnel tore open straight toward the surface. The resulting shockwave hurled the Dark Sorcerer backward, sending him tumbling across the ground. Lloyd emerged first, crawling out of the crater before immediately inching toward the Sorcerer with a horrifyingly twisted expression designed purely to intimidate him. He casually remarked that the Sorcerer had probably never witnessed an entrance quite like that before. The Dark Sorcerer instinctively staggered backward while gritting his teeth in frustration and fear. He could not comprehend what kind of monsters these two were. Desperately, he immediately clasped his hands together and activated another spell. A magic circle formed beneath him before violently convulsing. Moments later, a grotesque liquid burst forth from it like acidic vomit spilling from a monster's mouth. Secretly, the Sorcerer regained some confidence. Although his reincarnation spell had repeatedly failed, one valuable byproduct had emerged from those failures: an incredibly durable ghoul with skin as hard as steel. There was no way these intruders could leave even a scratch on it. Lloyd instantly recognized the danger and warned Javier that this opponent would be troublesome. He tried to explain the ghoul's weakness, but Javier moved before Lloyd could even finish. Leaping forward with frightening speed, Javier swung his sword upward. A blazing streak erupted from the slash. The mana blast surged through the air in a vertical line, carrying overwhelming force straight toward the ghoul. Then the creature split cleanly in half. The blazing mana collided with the foul liquid pouring from the ghoul's body, instantly turning everything into steaming vapor. The Dark Sorcerer's eyes widened in absolute disbelief. The ghoul had been cut apart in a single strike, not by the blade itself, but by the force released from it. To the Sorcerer, the sight was incomprehensible. The silver-haired knight standing before him was monstrously powerful. He could not help but wonder whether the man had already reached the level of a swordmaster. Lloyd himself looked equally shocked. That attack had not existed in the original story at all. Silently, Javier lifted his gaze toward the Dark Sorcerer. The cold cynicism in his eyes alone was enough to crush the man's spirit. At that moment, despair completely consumed the Dark Sorcerer. He became certain that he was going to die there. There was no possible way for him to defeat these two monsters. Lloyd bent down toward the Dark Sorcerer like a street thug cornering his victim, his face twisted with irritation as he reminded the man that abducting his workers had delayed construction by weeks. Then he demanded to know exactly how the Sorcerer intended to compensate him for the damage. Flat against the ground, the Sorcerer trembled in terror. Deep within, only one desperate thought remained. He would crawl on his hands and knees if necessary. He simply needed to survive. Frantically, he begged Lloyd for forgiveness and pleaded for his life. But Lloyd immediately shut him down, making it clear that he had no interest whatsoever in apologies. What mattered was payment. Panicking further, the Sorcerer desperately explained that the cave was filled with valuable tools and materials used for sorcery. In exchange for sparing him, he offered everything inside the dungeon. A cynical smile spread across Lloyd's face. Slowly, he confirmed whether the Sorcerer truly meant that everything in the cave now belonged to him. The Sorcerer hurriedly nodded and urged Lloyd to take it all. At that moment, Javier emerged from the chamber while supporting the rescued workers. He reported that the men were severely exhausted, but otherwise unharmed. Hearing that, Lloyd finally relaxed slightly. A few more days trapped inside, and the workers would have starved to death. Then Lloyd turned back toward the Sorcerer and demanded to know what he had originally intended to do with them. The Sorcerer hesitated before finally confessing that he had been researching methods to resurrect the dead. Lloyd's eyes widened in disbelief. He questioned whether such a thing was even possible in the first place, and demanded to know why the Sorcerer would go that far. The man's expression collapsed into despair as he admitted the truth. He had been trying to bring back his dead wife and child. For a moment, Lloyd quietly fell silent. The Sorcerer slowly continued his story. He had once served as a sorcerer in a lord's castle, and lived together with his family in what he considered a truly happy life. But the lord he served had desired his wife for himself. Fearing what would happen, the Sorcerer attempted to flee with his family, but they were found. Before the story could continue further, Lloyd abruptly stopped him with visible annoyance, refusing to listen to any more of the tragic explanation. Then his expression hardened completely. Lloyd coldly asked whether the Sorcerer sorcerer truly believed his wife and child would thank him for slaughtering innocent people just to revive them. The sorcerer desperately tried to respond, but Lloyd cut him off again before he could speak. He reminded the man of every innocent life sacrificed for those experiments. Every victim had possessed their own family, happiness, and life just as precious as his own. Lloyd demanded to know whether none of that had mattered simply because the sorcerer himself had suffered a tragedy. No matter how sorrowful the story sounded, it could never change what he had become. A serial murderer. The sorcerer bit down on his lips as tears slowly streamed down his face. Lloyd slowly shook his head before turning away from Lupellin. He warned the Dark Sorcerer that he would later return with his men to collect everything inside the laboratory, but if Lupellin ever harmed another person again, there would be absolutely no mercy next time. As Lloyd began walking away, Lupellin's voice trembled behind him in disbelief and overwhelming relief. The sorcerer repeatedly thanked him, unable to believe he had been spared, but privately, Lloyd's thoughts were far colder. In the original novel, Javier had forgiven Lupellin as well and merely driven him out of the laboratory. After that, the sorcerer went on to murder hundreds more people while altering his own body through twisted experiments. Eventually becoming a recurring enemy, Javier was forced to battle again and again. And the reason Lloyd had turned his back while fully aware of all this was simple. He had expected this exact outcome from the very beginning. The instant Lloyd's back was exposed, Lupellin lunged forward with a vicious grin, dark magical energy wrapping around his hands. At that exact moment, Lloyd turned around. The killing intent in his eyes alone froze the sorcerer in place. Coldly, Lloyd reminded him that he had already warned him there would be no mercy. Fear instantly swallowed Lupellin whole. Before the sorcerer could react further, Javier stepped forward, drew his sword, and slashed once. Lupellin's head separated from his body instantly as blood erupted from the severed neck. But Lloyd never directly watched it happen. No matter how much his life had changed, Kim Soo-ho still remained inside him. Deep down, he still disliked seeing people die. That moment brought back an old memory from his previous life. Back when he had worked on construction sites as Kim Soo-ho, there had been an older worker who constantly harassed him over the smallest things. The man endlessly cursed at him, insulted him, and nitpicked every action, even yelling that his bows lacked proper respect. Every single time it happened, Soo-ho would lower his head and apologize politely, promising to be more careful next time. The old man never stopped. He continued cursing, mocking, and insulting him day after day. Back then, Soo-ho always tried convincing himself of the same principles. Kindness created kindness. Avoid conflict whenever possible. Conflict only created more conflict. He endured everything believing that if he treated others respectfully, that respect would eventually return to him someday. But reality had been different. The next day, even after politely greeting the old man again, the response had only been more abuse and mockery. The man cursed at him for speaking too loudly, insulted him endlessly, and treated him like a pathetic pushover. Inside, Soo-ho desperately tried to suppress his anger. He repeatedly told himself to ignore it, let it go, and maintain inner peace. If he exploded now, things would only worsen. Then the old man crossed the line. While walking away, he insulted Soo-ho's parents and laughed mockingly. At that moment, the patient Soo-ho had been suppressing for so long finally snapped. Quietly, he approached the man from behind and placed a hand on his shoulder. The instant the old man turned around, Soo-ho's fist slammed straight into his face. The impact grotesquely distorted the man's expression as chaos erupted across the construction site. Shocked workers shouted in confusion, while Soo-ho completely lost control, raining punches down relentlessly before kicking the man away. The other workers eventually rushed in and restrained him. Yet even while beating the man senseless, one thought had continuously repeated inside Soo-ho's head. He was completely screwed. But surprisingly, the next day at work passed normally. When the two encountered each other again, Soo-ho had expected retaliation or consequences. Instead, the old man quietly turned away and left him alone. That day, Soo-ho finally understood something. There were times when violence had to be stopped with violence. People constantly insisted that one should never sink to a villain's level, but Lloyd found that logic laughable. In his eyes, that kind of thinking was exactly why criminals, fraudsters, and murderers often escaped with meaningless punishment while hiding behind excuses about rights and sympathy. Several hours later, everyone safely escaped the cave. The rescued workers slowly carried the laboratory materials on their backs while stumbling forward in exhaustion. Their bodies were weak and drained after being imprisoned by the Dark Sorcerer for so long, yet despite everything, they were alive. Lloyd watched the rescued workers struggle under the weight of the bags they carried. Without hesitation, Lloyd walked over and ordered them to hand over their bags. The workers immediately panicked and insisted they could still manage somehow, but Lloyd clicked his tongue in annoyance and bluntly explained that if they collapsed, he would end up carrying both them and the luggage anyway. To him, that would only create more work. Then he pointed at the others one after another and ordered them to hand over everything as well. Without waiting for another response, he grabbed the bundles of straw and slung them over his own back. The workers became even more flustered and embarrassed, insisting that someone like him should not be carrying their loads personally. In response, Lloyd flashed his usual arrogant grin and threatened that if anyone complained again, nobody would receive bonuses. That single sentence instantly silenced the entire group. Behind him, the workers quietly stared at his back with deeply moved expressions. Javier observed the entire scene in silence. Even now, he still could not fully understand Lloyd Frontera. Javier genuinely could not tell whether Lloyd was only helping because he wanted to avoid extra trouble later, or whether he was truly worried about the workers' condition. But after watching the exhausted men behind them, Javier realized something else. At this moment, the reason no longer mattered. To those workers, Lloyd had already become someone they could trust and willingly follow. Just then, the system notification appeared before Lloyd. The rescued soldiers had been deeply moved by his actions, and through their words, the story of what happened there would soon spread everywhere. The system even described it as a rewarding experience. Lloyd immediately scoffed at the message. If the reward was not money, then he had absolutely no interest in it whatsoever. The moment Lloyd returned to the village, he immediately threw himself back into construction work. Day after day, the final stages of the Seok Bingo slowly took shape until the structure finally stood completed before the tribe. After the finishing touches were added and the roof was covered with grass, the project was finally complete. Arush looked around the inside of the structure with curiosity. This was the Seok Bingo Lloyd had promised them, yet despite arriving exactly on schedule, the young orc looked visibly disappointed. To him, the inside only felt slightly cooler than the outside wasteland. If things remained like this, the meat would still spoil, and spoiled meat inevitably meant muscle loss. Lloyd, however, maintained his usual sly smile. Naturally, the building would not function properly yet. There was still no ice inside. As far as Lloyd was concerned, the Seok Bingo was not truly finished yet. Arush immediately grew confused. He knew what ice was, but ice simply did not exist in a blazing wasteland like this. Without losing his grin, Lloyd casually declared that if they did not have ice, they could simply make some themselves. That answer only confused Arush even more. When the young orc asked how such a thing was even possible, Lloyd confidently answered with absolutely no explanation whatsoever. Somehow, Arush silently stared at him. Inside, doubt slowly crept into the young orc's mind. For a brief moment, he genuinely wondered whether he had accidentally brought a complete conman back to the village. He even questioned whether the story about the Ant Queen had been fabricated too. At that exact moment, the system notification appeared before Lloyd, informing him that Arush was not nearly as stupid as Lloyd had originally assumed. Lloyd immediately snapped back at the system, furiously denying the accusation and insisting those thoughts belonged to the system itself. The system instantly rejected the blame and shamelessly insisted that Lloyd absolutely had considered Arush an idiot before. Meanwhile, Arush quietly shook his head. Deep down, he reminded himself that Lloyd had saved his life. Because of that, he should not think badly of him. Awkwardly, the young orc offered his help before leaving. Lloyd enthusiastically reassured him not to worry and confidently promised that everything would be completed soon. The moment Arush disappeared, Javier immediately turned toward Lloyd and calmly asked the most important question of all. How exactly was Lloyd planning to make ice? The confident expression vanished instantly. Sweating nervously, Lloyd slowly turned toward Javier and admitted that it was actually a very good question. Then he openly asked Javier what they should do. Javier stared at him in complete disbelief. That expression on Lloyd's face made everything painfully obvious. He genuinely had no plan whatsoever. Javier immediately exploded, asking whether Lloyd had seriously signed a contract with the orcs without even knowing how to fulfill it. To Javier, this looked dangerously close to outright fraud. But Lloyd instantly launched into a passionate lecture instead. He demanded to know whether Javier understood what unsuccessful people all had in common. Javier remained completely bewildered by the sudden topic change. Meanwhile, Lloyd passionately explained that failures always buried themselves beneath excuses. They endlessly listed reasons why something could not be done without even attempting it in the first place. Successful people, however, were different. According to Lloyd, those people charged forward first and somehow figured everything out afterward. Clenching his fist dramatically, Lloyd proudly declared that this very mindset was the essence of innovation itself. Javier remained entirely unmoved by the speech. Within, he calmly concluded that people like Lloyd were far more likely to fail catastrophically than succeed. Time slowly passed, and before long, night had completely fallen over the wasteland. Sitting alone atop a rock, Lloyd quietly organized his thoughts while desperately searching for a solution. Inside his mind, ideas rapidly connected together. First, they needed to create a giant mold for an ice block. After that, Padang and Bengal could transport water from the lake to fill it. The real problem was freezing it. This world already possessed ice magic, which meant the principle itself was possible. Magic manipulated mana and rearranged its properties at will. During his daily mana training, Lloyd had already sensed that different forms of mana naturally existed throughout the world, each possessing unique characteristics. Mages simply manipulated and rearranged those properties into magic. After thinking everything through carefully, a grin slowly spread across Lloyd's face. Naturally, he himself could not freely wield mana like a proper mage, but he could imitate something similar, the Azrahan core technique. Lloyd finally decided it was time to begin. After consuming the red sunflower seeds, Padang and Bengal had grown enormously large. Their swollen cheeks and bellies held massive amounts of water gathered from the lake. Then, with a violent splash, the two summons spat the water into the massive rock mold prepared inside the Seog Bingo. Lloyd immediately moved toward the corner of the structure and grabbed the pile of wheat straw. He stuffed the straw into the surrounding water before rolling up his sleeves and plunging both arms into the freezing liquid. Then the real challenge began. Lloyd focused intensely while activating the Azrahan core technique. His goal was simple in theory: absorb only the warm mana from the water while leaving behind the cold mana. Unfortunately, his first attempt completely failed. Instead, he accidentally absorbed the cold mana first and immediately panicked, trying to reverse the process while cursing under his breath. The task was far more difficult than he had expected. Even so, Lloyd refused to give up. Slowly and carefully, he focused harder than before. Bit by bit, he attempted to isolate only the warm mana floating within the water. Nearby, Javier silently watched the entire process unfold. Earlier, Javier had dismissed Lloyd's philosophy of starting first and figuring things out later as reckless nonsense. It sounded irresponsible and absurd. Yet now, Lloyd was genuinely finding a solution through sheer stubborn persistence, almost as if he were proudly proving Javier wrong. At that point, Javier realized there truly was no stopping him anymore. Meanwhile, Lloyd completely immersed himself in the process. 1 hour passed, then another, and finally the water began to change. The warmth within it slowly faded as the warm mana weakened little by little. The temperature steadily dropped, and before long, thin sheets of ice began forming across the surface. At the same moment, a system notification appeared before Lloyd. He had successfully developed a new application of the Azrahan core technique, and due to the tremendous effort involved, the skill itself had grown stronger. The Seog Bingo was finally complete, and with it came the promise of an enormous reward. Several days later, the entire Sand and Steel tribe descended into absolute chaos. The moment the orcs stepped inside the completed Seog Bingo, their eyes widened in total shock. Loud cries erupted everywhere as they marveled at the freezing air inside the structure. To the orcs, who had lived their entire lives in the scorching wasteland, the cold felt almost miraculous. Lloyd casually tapped against the massive ice block while explaining that all that remained now was properly arranging the installation. Akush could barely contain his excitement. With this structure, the tribe would no longer need to throw away spoiled meat. Arush became even more ecstatic at the realization that they no longer needed to hunt every single day just to avoid muscle loss. Naturally, he immediately announced a celebration. In honor of the occasion, the entire tribe would apparently celebrate with Triceps Training Day. The square erupted into roaring excitement as the orcs enthusiastically prepared for the event. Watching the scene unfold, Lloyd slowly turned toward Javier with a smug grin plastered across his face. Pointing at his own head, he proudly signaled what he considered the mindset of a true entrepreneur. Javier simply sighed in defeat and admitted that Lloyd had been right once again. Moments later, Akush stepped forward before the entire tribe and formally expressed their deep gratitude toward Lloyd. In response, Lloyd humbly bowed and insisted he had merely fulfilled the terms of their contract, and with that, Lloyd Frontera finally obtained 120 orc workers. But Akush was not finished yet. The orc chief proudly declared that orcs differed from humans. They did not simply take kindness for granted because of contracts. When an orc felt genuine gratitude, they repaid it wholeheartedly. Then Akush made a formal vow before the entire tribe. From that moment onward, the Sand and Steel tribe and the Frontera family would stand together as blood brothers. Immediately, every orc shifted into a dramatic three-quarter rear pose while flexing their backs and biceps before roaring the declaration together in unison. The Fronteras were now friends of the Sand and Steel tribe. Anyone who became an enemy of the Fronteras would also become an enemy of the tribe itself. If trouble ever came for Lloyd, the orcs swore they would stand beside him. Right afterward, another system notification appeared before Lloyd. The tribe had completely opened their hearts to him. The orcs now recognized him as a true friend, and their approval rating had risen significantly. Increasing his RP, completely caught up in the tribe's overwhelming energy, Lloyd raised his voice proudly alongside them and shouted for the long life of the Sand and Steel tribe. Several days later, after enduring the long and exhausting journey back, Lloyd and the others finally returned to town alongside the 120 orc workers. Naturally, the townspeople were terrified. The sight of over 100 gigantic muscle-bound orcs marching into town was horrifying enough to freeze the streets into silence. Even Baron Frontera, who already knew Lloyd had gone to negotiate with the Sand and Steel tribe, visibly stiffened the moment he saw the orcs in person. Watching the panic spread across town, Lloyd quietly admitted to himself that he would probably need to make some kind of public announcement soon. To most people, orcs were terrifying monsters before anything else. Still, despite the chaos, there was an unexpected bonus waiting for him. The system informed Lloyd that stories of him defeating the Dark Sorcerer and rescuing the abducted soldiers were rapidly spreading throughout the region. People everywhere were praising his courage and heroism. Lloyd, however, cared far less about the praise itself. What truly mattered was the RP. Meanwhile, practical concerns immediately returned to his mind. The Baron had promised to find wealthy merchants willing to buy the orcs' bizarre exercise equipment, leaving only the Dark Sorcerer's laboratory tools remaining to be dealt with. Nearby, Javier calmly asked whether anything among those tools actually possessed monetary value. Lloyd admitted he was unsure. Before selling anything, he first wanted to examine whether there was something useful hidden among the items. As he flipped through the sorcerer's books and documents, something suddenly caught his attention. Lloyd's eyes widened instantly. Then, without warning, he bolted out of the room. He shouted for Javier to handle the cleanup while he rushed toward the mine at full speed. Breathing heavily, Lloyd sprinted all the way to the entrance before bursting inside and loudly demanding to know where Tordes was. Moments later, Tordes appeared while carrying a pickaxe, startled by Lloyd's sudden arrival. The moment Lloyd spotted him, relief spread across his face. Then he excitedly brought up the contract Tordes had signed earlier, the one requiring him to work for 520 years. Tordes weakly acknowledged it. Lloyd cheerfully explained that realistically speaking, such a contract was absurd anyway. At first glance, it had almost sounded like a joke. But now, according to Lloyd, Tordes no longer had to worry about fulfilling the impossible terms as a normal human. While flipping through the sorcerer's research notes, Lloyd proudly revealed the reason. Inside the book was a spell capable of transforming corpses into controllable ghouls. To Lloyd, this meant Tordes could continue working for the entire 520 years without issue. Lloyd looked genuinely thrilled by the idea and enthusiastically described it as exciting and fun. Meanwhile, Tordes stood completely frozen. Already exhausted from endless labor inside the mines, he looked so emotionally shattered that it almost seemed as though his soul had left his body entirely. Still expecting a reaction, Lloyd waited eagerly, but when none came, his expression slowly turned cold. He quietly questioned whether he was somehow the only one excited about this incredible idea and ordered Tordes to smile. Tordes remained motionless for several seconds before tears suddenly streamed down his face. Then, while forcing the most broken smile imaginable onto his face, he silently complied. Completely satisfied, Lloyd chuckled and encouraged him to continue working hard. At that exact moment, the system notification appeared before Lloyd once again. Apparently, the ruler of the underworld had become deeply impressed by Lloyd's actions and wished to offer him a position. Lloyd immediately feigned innocence, demanding to know what exactly he had done wrong this time. The system calmly replied that the offer was completely genuine. After leaving the mines, Lloyd headed straight toward the mansion while organizing his next priorities in his head. He still needed to discuss several matters with the Baron. However, upon arriving at the Baron's office, Lloyd discovered that the room was completely empty. As Lloyd searched the mansion for the Baron, one of the maids nervously informed him that the Baron was currently entertaining guests in the reception room. When Lloyd asked who the visitors were, the maid hesitantly revealed their names: Shilof and Meatloaf. The instant Lloyd heard those names, his expression twisted into a deeply sinister grin that horrified the maid on the spot. Meanwhile, inside the reception room, the atmosphere had already grown tense. Shilof calmly explained that their organization normally demanded full repayment of the loan principal in one payment. However, this time they were supposedly willing to make a special exception and allow the Frontera family to repay 10% of the principal instead. Naturally, the condition attached to that kindness was the transfer of ownership rights to the mine. Meatloaf pressed the Silent Baron further, insisting the arrangement would reduce the interest burden and therefore benefit the Frontera estate greatly. The Baron, however, remained unable to answer. Then suddenly a knock echoed through the room. Lloyd announced himself from outside. The Baron immediately welcomed him inside, almost like a drowning man spotting rescue. The moment Lloyd entered, he cheerfully greeted the two loan sharks as though meeting old friends after many years. He even politely expressed hope that both of them had been doing well. Meatloaf instantly shoved an official invitation document toward Lloyd and warned him not to attempt any threats again. Lloyd casually acknowledged the document while praising them as intellectual gentlemen. Then, while grinning widely, he mentioned overhearing the absolutely wonderful offer they had proposed and politely asked whether he could present an offer of his own. Meatloaf immediately rejected the idea and declared he had no interest in hearing anything from Lloyd. Ignoring him entirely, Lloyd calmly announced his proposal anyway. From now on, the Frontera family would repay the debt in smaller installments, and naturally, the interest rates would be lowered accordingly. Meatloaf exploded in outrage, furiously reminding Lloyd that he had already refused to hear the proposal in the first place. But Lloyd's smile never faded. He pointed out how unfair it was that the two moneylenders could endlessly throw terrible offers at the Frontera, while he himself was apparently forbidden from doing the same. Frankly, Lloyd found that extremely upsetting. At that exact moment, a booming voice thundered through the reception hall. Arush stepped into the room. The young orc glared fiercely at the two loan sharks while demanding to know who dared anger his Frontera brother. Instantly, terror gripped both Shilof and Meatloaf. Arush's expression darkened even further as he warned them that anyone causing trouble for the Fronteras would face the full wrath of the Sand and Steel tribe. Lloyd immediately pretended to calm him down, insisting that nobody was causing problems and that Meatloaf simply happened to possess a naturally loud voice. Arush, however, remained unconvinced. To him, it had sounded very much like they were yelling at Lloyd. Maintaining his harmless smile, Lloyd smoothly returned to the negotiation and gently encouraged them to reconsider his proposal. Refusing it, after all, might end up hurting his feelings. Beside him, Arush ground his teeth furiously and quietly declared that anyone who hurt the feelings of the Fronteras would be torn to pieces. At that moment, Lloyd's grin transformed into something far more terrifying. Matching Arush's murderous energy perfectly, he began laughing like an unhinged villain. The two loan sharks completely broke. Terrified for their lives, they immediately accepted Lloyd's conditions before fleeing the mansion as fast as possible. Once they were gone, Lloyd turned toward the Baron and explained that if things had truly gone according to his wishes, he would have erased the debt entirely. Unfortunately, that would technically count as a crime, so these revised terms would have to suffice for now. The Baron could only nod weakly while thanking him. Lloyd then calmly summarized the estate's improving situation. The Ondal construction business was steadily expanding, and the soft coal mining operation was progressing smoothly as well. At this rate, paying off the debt would not take very long. Since the Baron's name remained attached to the contract, Lloyd reminded him to keep the document safe. The Baron quietly accepted it. However, Lloyd quickly revealed that an enormous problem still remained unresolved. If they failed to deal with it soon, the estate could fall into even deeper trouble. Then Lloyd glanced toward the orcs and let out an awkward laugh. Those monsters ate 10 times more food than ordinary humans, and feeding 120 of them was becoming catastrophically expensive. The very next day, the orc miners marched into the mines as though they were charging into war. With pickaxes and shovels raised high, they attacked the rocks with overwhelming enthusiasm, flexing their strength with every swing. They kept digging relentlessly without showing even the slightest hint of exhaustion. Then a terrified report suddenly reached Lloyd. The moment he heard it, he rushed straight toward the mine and demanded to know where the problem was. The workers hurriedly pointed toward one particular orc in absolute horror. Apparently, the man had been mining continuously for 24 straight hours without stopping once. Lloyd's expression immediately twisted. He ordered the workers to drag the orc out of the mine at once and firmly declared that he was forbidden from returning until the following day. The orc violently resisted the entire time, roaring in despair that he did not want to rest because he still wanted to work out. His precious muscles apparently demanded more training. Watching the absurd scene unfold, Lloyd could not help realizing the terrifying truth. Thanks to the orcs' insane physical abilities and their pathological addiction to exercise, productivity inside the mines had increased more than tenfold. And somehow things became even worse. When Lloyd brought up wages, Arush looked genuinely confused and explained that orcs had no use for money whatsoever. They outright refused to be paid. However, the tribe did have one condition. As long as their stomachs remained full, they were satisfied. Unfortunately, that condition alone was catastrophically expensive. Lloyd immediately turned toward the Baron and bluntly declared that tax revenue needed to increase exponentially. Feeding over 100 orcs required enormous amounts of meat, and despite the mines becoming vastly more productive, the estate could still collapse under the food costs if nothing changed. The Baron understood the logic, but he also knew the condition of the territory's people. Life was already difficult enough for them. Raising taxes further would only crush them completely. Lloyd immediately shook his head. Blindly increasing taxes without reason was nothing more than robbery. If people lost everything they earned, nobody would bother working hard anymore, and eventually tax revenues would collapse instead of growing. He understood that perfectly. So when the Baron asked how exactly he planned to increase tax revenue without burdening the people further, Lloyd answered immediately. The solution was simple. The people themselves needed to become rich. Lloyd then revealed his true target, the forgotten northern lands known as the Merit's Wetlands. He intended to transform the abandoned swamps into farmland and distribute that land directly to the people. Once the citizens became wealthy through farming, the resulting taxes would naturally flow back into the estate. The Merit's Wetlands, however, were infamous for a reason. The area was an enormous muddy swamp abandoned for centuries, filled with unstable ground and mysterious creatures lurking beneath the waters. Farming there was considered impossible. As Lloyd and Javier traveled through the wetlands together, Javier questioned how anyone could possibly cultivate land like this. Lloyd confidently replied that he already had a plan, but privately, the truth was far less reassuring. Deep within, Lloyd admitted to himself that he only said that because he had to. Transforming terrain on this scale would be unbelievably difficult. There were too many variables involved, especially with rainfall constantly threatening to flood everything again. Somehow, he needed to create a drainage system capable of controlling all that water. And because there were no modern tools available in this world, Lloyd ultimately reached a painful conclusion. He would have to solve everything the old-fashioned way. Days passed after that. Lloyd continuously exhausted himself, constructing embankments and waterways across the wetlands. Yet despite all the labor and money being poured into the project, failure still loomed constantly over his head. If the water failed to drain properly in the end, every bit of effort would become meaningless. That possibility terrified him more than anything else. At one point, Lloyd quietly wished he could at least run a simulation like he would have in his previous world. If only he could feed the entire topographical layout of the Merit's Wetlands into a supercomputer, he could calculate everything instantly. But in this world, that kind of technology simply did not exist. Nearby, the Baron and Javier silently observed him from a distance. After watching Lloyd continue working day after day, the Baron quietly asked how long it had been. Javier answered that 21 days had already passed. During all that time, Lloyd had barely rested and hardly eaten properly either. Javier even asked whether he should forcibly stop him, but the Baron slowly shook his head. Although he was Lloyd's father, there had once been a time when he truly despised his own son. Back then, he constantly wondered whether Lloyd would ever become a proper man at all. Yet now, the man before him seemed completely different. almost miraculously different. Lloyd was genuinely exhausting himself for the sake of the land and its people. The Baron knew he might not be capable of helping much, but at the very least, he did not want to stand in Lloyd's way anymore. Javier quietly agreed. The current Lloyd Frontera was the kind of person who would never stop once he decided to keep a promise. Even after all that, Lloyd continued working obsessively without rest until another night finally arrived. Under the pale moonlight, the result of his endless labor finally revealed itself. Spread across the ground was a massive miniature model of the Merit's Wetlands, nearly 13 feet wide and long. Every embankment, waterway, and elevation had been painstakingly recreated by hand. Exhaustion washed over Lloyd's entire body, yet a satisfied grin slowly spread across his face. To him, the model looked perfect. Then, as water finally began flowing properly through the channels, Lloyd suddenly erupted into celebration. The drainage was working. The water was finally draining away exactly as intended. And in Lloyd's eyes, the flowing water already resembled streams of future tax revenue pouring directly into his pockets. He practically welcomed the image of golden coins flooding toward him with open arms. Completely drained, Lloyd collapsed onto the ground while smiling weakly to himself. The entire process had been unbelievably exhausting, but compared to the sleepless nights he once endured doing endless construction part-time jobs back in Korea, this somehow still felt manageable. At that exact moment, a notification suddenly echoed inside his head. His efforts had significantly influenced the special skill known as architectural design, unlocking an entirely new ability. Immediately, Lloyd's eyes widened. The newly unlocked option was simulation mode. By using survey data gathered from terrain, the skill could generate a virtual simulation model. The reward completely exceeded anything Lloyd had expected, but rather than remain shocked, he instantly sprang into action. A holographic projection appeared before him. Quickly, Lloyd imported all the survey data from the Merit's Wetlands into the simulation. The virtual terrain rose and shifted according to the movements of his fingers, while the muddy water streamed naturally toward the lower elevations exactly as it would in reality. The moment he realized what the skill could do, Lloyd exploded in outrage. He furiously demanded to know why the system had waited until now to reveal such an ability after he had already worked himself to death for an entire month. The system calmly reminded him that he himself had previously claimed the work wasn't that bad. Lloyd immediately snapped back, insisting that he had only been pretending to be tough and that the work had actually been unbelievably miserable. The system then explained that skills only enhanced knowledge and abilities Lloyd had personally acquired through his own efforts. Everything originated from his wish. Hearing that word again caused Lloyd to pause. He recalled the very first moment he had arrived in this world, when the system mentioned his wish before. Even now, he still did not understand what it truly meant. As far as Lloyd knew, all he had ever wanted was an ordinary life. Survive college, earn his qualifications, join a decent company, and live without constantly worrying about money. To him, those had simply been normal life goals, but the system rejected that explanation. Those were merely goals. A true wish was something far stronger, something capable of transcending even time and space itself. Lloyd immediately brushed the strange explanation aside and dusted off his clothes in annoyance. If the system intended to keep speaking nonsense, then he wanted no part in the conversation. He had far too much work left to do. Then Lloyd called out to Padong and Bangul. The two summons immediately responded cheerfully. Grinning mischievously, Lloyd announced that he was planning to summon some new friends for them. The following morning, sunlight poured down across the wetlands as Lloyd officially prepared to begin the first stage of the Merit's Wetlands Reclamation Project. The task was simple in theory. Podong and Bangul needed to remove all the water from the wetlands. The moment the two summons looked across the endless stretch of swamp, they froze in complete shock. Even Podong began frantically babbling in protest, clearly insisting that the amount of water was absurdly beyond their abilities. Lloyd, however, only smiled reassuringly. Of course, the task was too large for only two summons. That was precisely why he intended to give them new companions immediately. Inside, Lloyd made his decision. He would spend every bit of RP he had accumulated. Then, without hesitation, Lloyd opened the random summon window. Lloyd carefully calculated the RP costs while staring at the summon window. Each summon required 100 RP, and the cost increased by 1.5 times after every attempt. After doing the math, he realized he could afford exactly 4 summons. That was more than enough. He did not care about special abilities this time. All he needed were summons capable of growing gigantic like Podong and Bangul, so they could could carry enormous amounts of water from the wetlands. Still muttering to himself, Lloyd grumbled about how annoyingly loud the summon system was every single time it activated. Then the summoning began. A magic circle spread through the air as pale light engulfed the surroundings. Moments later, the third summon finally revealed itself. A shockwave burst outward at the same time, smacking directly into Lloyd's face and sending him stumbling backwards several steps. Then he saw it clearly. Standing there was a tiny, chubby, yellow baby hippopotamus. Its name was Hamong. The little creature looked up at Lloyd with a bright and innocent smile plastered across its face. For several seconds, Lloyd could only stare blankly. Then, almost unconsciously, he muttered in disbelief. A water-loving hippopotamus. What exactly was something like this doing here? Meanwhile, Padang and Bangle immediately welcomed the newcomer warmly like proud older siblings greeting a new family member. Ignoring the emotional reunion entirely, Lloyd interrupted and asked Hamang for its instruction manual. Hamang obediently opened its mouth. Just as Lloyd expected, a horribly crumpled note sat inside. After pulling it out and carefully unfolding it, Lloyd's expression instantly soured. Apparently, unlike Podong and Bangle, Hamang did not grow larger by eating red sunflower seeds. To Lloyd, this immediately sounded like a defective summon. Disappointed, he demanded the system reopen the summon game window so he could try again. The system immediately informed him that the summon game could only be played once per day. Lloyd clicked his tongue in frustration and declared the whole thing a complete waste. Watching him openly belittle Hamang deeply upset Padang and Bangle. Bangle angrily protested while Padang tried comforting the devastated little hippo. Lloyd, however, defended himself shamelessly. From his perspective, they obviously needed larger summons for a massive project like draining the wetlands. Apparently, the discrimination against their new companion was the final straw. Padang and Bangle immediately organized a labor strike. The two summons even raised tiny protest banners demanding that Lloyd acknowledge the value of labor properly. Faced with the absurd rebellion, Lloyd quickly surrendered before things escalated any further. Finally calming down, he turned toward Hamang and asked what kind of ability it actually possessed. If the skill happened to involve dehumidifying moisture or something similarly useless, Lloyd had already decided the creature could simply live inside his closet. Then the system displayed Hamang's special skill, One Shot. Lloyd blinked in confusion. After some questioning, he finally understood the ability's meaning. Hamang could drink enormous quantities of water in a single gulp. Excited now, Lloyd immediately asked how much water the hippo could hold. Hamang proudly smacked its own belly in response. Lloyd interpreted that to mean as much water as its stomach could contain. The brief excitement instantly faded again. Inside, Lloyd sighed bitterly. For a moment, he had truly believed he had summoned the perfect creature for the Wetlands project. Clearly, his luck had simply been too good to last. Still, he decided not to judge Hamang too quickly, so he encouraged the little hippo to demonstrate the skill properly. Hamang nodded enthusiastically several times before waddling toward the wetlands spread out before them, and then it began drinking, and the sight that followed completely shattered Lloyd's expectations. A violent suction roared across the wetlands. Water disappeared at terrifying speed. In the blink of an eye, the water line rapidly retreated away from Lloyd's feet as though the swamp itself were being devoured whole. At the same time, Hamang's body began growing larger and larger, yet despite the tremendous growth, Hamang never stopped drinking. Instead, it plunged its face even deeper into the wetlands, while the surrounding land rapidly emptied of water. Lloyd slowly lifted his head upward to follow the ever-growing creature. At that moment, he felt both awe and absolute terror simultaneously. Deep within, Lloyd was utterly stunned. Hamang was drinking unbelievable amounts of water at terrifying speed. At this rate, the wetlands could genuinely be drained within only a few days. Nearby, Padang and Bangle proudly puffed themselves up while staring smugly at Lloyd's shocked expression. Lloyd immediately demanded to know why the two of them suddenly looked so arrogant. Then, narrowing his eyes suspiciously, Lloyd called out to the system messenger and questioned whether the summon system was truly random at all. Somehow, he always seemed to receive exactly the abilities he needed most. The system answered with its usual vague attitude. Normally, people transported to another world possessed some kind of special power from the start. Lloyd, on the other hand, had arrived with no luck, no talent, and what the system described as a whole collection of handicaps. So perhaps his special ability was obtaining absurdly lucky summons, or perhaps not. The completely useless answer immediately irritated Lloyd even more. Just then, Hamang enthusiastically demanded even more water. The moment Lloyd heard that, his eyes gleamed. He proudly declared that Hamang should drink as much as it wanted because the next day they would officially begin reclaiming the Merit's wetlands. And so, the project finally began. The following day, 120 engineers gathered at the site and collectively froze in horror the moment they saw Hamang's true size. First, Hamang removed enormous amounts of water from the wetlands. Then the gigantic hippo carried the water to the river, spat everything out, shrank back down, and repeated the process over and over again without stopping. Once the ground became exposed, the workers removed weeds and debris, while the orcs and engineers immediately began reshaping the terrain. Mana blasts tore holes throughout the soil before bamboo stalks were inserted deep into the earth. Sand was piled across the wetlands to create stable embankments, while Podong compacted the ground with overwhelming force. To remove water trapped deep beneath the soil, Lloyd used the bamboo stalks like gigantic straws. Then Hamang would simply drink everything again in one shot. Afterward, Lloyd used the upgraded simulation skill to construct levees precisely according to the terrain calculations. 10 days later, an entire sector had been completed successfully. Standing atop the construction site, Lloyd clenched his fists and shouted toward the workers that there was still plenty of labor remaining ahead of them. Then he loudly demanded to know what awaited them once the project was finally completed. The workers immediately roared the answer back in unison: a bonus party. Lloyd instantly matched their enthusiasm and rallied everyone forward again. At that point, distinctions between people had almost disappeared. Lloyd, Javier, the Summons, the Orcs, and the Engineers all worked together as one united construction team. And just like that, 3 entire months passed. During that time, Javier quietly found himself staring across the transformed land in disbelief. The wetlands were truly becoming farmland. The endless wasteland that had remained abandoned for centuries was steadily transforming into fertile fields. At the same time, another realization suddenly struck him. Without even noticing, he himself had become completely absorbed into the construction work as though it were the most natural thing in the world. He was supposed to be a knight. At one point, he genuinely struggled to remember what his duties had originally been before Lloyd dragged him into this endless chaos. Then, before Javier could think further, Lloyd suddenly came running toward him. Excitedly, Lloyd shoved seeds into Javier's hands and ordered him to plant them across a distant section of the fields while carefully looking after them. Javier immediately reminded Lloyd that he was a knight and questioned why he was being assigned farming duties. Without hesitation, Lloyd dramatically claimed the seeds were necessary for pest control and begged the Great Knight to save the land. Somehow, Javier once again found himself unable to refuse. Quietly sighing, he planted the seeds and watered them himself, while internally realizing the painful truth. Lloyd had tricked him again, and next time, he absolutely needed to escape before getting dragged into more labor. At that moment, the Baron and Baroness arrived at the wetlands together. The Baron gazed across the transformed land with visible amazement. Not only him, but everyone in the territory was likely thinking the exact same thing. What Lloyd was accomplishing felt like a miracle. Soon, crowds of people from throughout the estate gathered to witness the unbelievable sight with their own eyes. The useless wetlands, once dismissed as worthless land, were gradually transforming into enormous stretches of fertile rice paddies and farmland. System notifications continuously appeared before Lloyd's eyes. The people of the Frontera barony were overwhelmed with awe and admiration for the miracle unfolding before them, and because of that, Lloyd received an enormous amount of bonus RP as a reward. Even without the notifications, Lloyd could already feel it himself. As construction neared completion, excitement throughout the entire territory was steadily growing. Hope had begun spreading among the people alongside anticipation for the future. Lloyd slowly lifted his head toward the sky. Summer was beginning to fade away. Although the heavens remained bright and cloudless, the sunlight somehow felt farther away than before, carrying the subtle arrival of a new season. Satisfied with the progress, Lloyd declared that only one major task remained. They needed to construct a water wheel. Javier immediately questioned its purpose. Lloyd explained that once the rainy season arrived, the reclaimed farmland would flood all over again unless they built a system capable of draining the incoming water continuously. The water wheel would solve that problem. By now, the engineer he summoned to assist with the project should have already arrived, but strangely, the engineer was nowhere to be seen. Instead, an entirely different group approached from the distance. Lloyd narrowed his eyes toward them suspiciously and asked who they were. Javier quickly recognized them. The group belonged to Viscount Lacona, the noble who ruled the lands north of the Merit's wetlands. The moment they approached the construction site, one of the Viscount's knights immediately demanded to know whether Lloyd was the one overseeing the operation. Javier instantly grew irritated at the knight's rude tone and attempted to correct his manners, but Lloyd casually stopped him before he could continue. With a relaxed smile, Lloyd simply confirmed that he was indeed in charge, and politely asked whether there was a problem. The knight immediately declared that the land belonged to Viscount Lacona and ordered Lloyd's group to leave the area at once. The moment Lloyd heard that, memories from the novel resurfaced within his mind. For centuries, nobody had cared about the Merit's wetlands because the area was considered worthless wasteland. However, administratively, the northern portion technically belonged to Viscount Lacona, while the southern portion fell under Baron Frontera's jurisdiction. The Viscount had clearly waited until the wetlands became valuable before appearing to assert ownership. He intended to seize fertile land created through Lloyd's labor without contributing anything himself. Deep within, Lloyd honestly admitted that the Viscount's claim was not entirely unreasonable. Technically, the northern wetlands did belong to him, for now at least. A faint smirk slowly appeared across Lloyd's face. Then, with deliberate calmness, Lloyd repeated the Viscount's accusation aloud, asking whether they were claiming his people were trespassing on Lacona territory. The knight proudly confirmed it and began explaining that Viscount Lacona possessed legal rights over the land through royal authority. But before he could continue further, Lloyd abruptly cut him off. Coldly, he questioned why a mere knight was speaking while nobles were conversing, and harshly ordered the man to keep his mouth shut. Then Lloyd completely ignored the furious knight and shifted his attention toward the Viscount himself. The knight atop the black horse instantly twisted his expression in anger. Nearby, many of Lloyd's workers reacted similarly, clearly stunned by Lloyd's audacity. Completely unfazed, Lloyd politely bowed and formally introduced himself as Lloyd Frontera, the eldest son of Baron Frontera. Viscount Lacona looked at him coldly. He openly stated that he had already heard rumors about Lloyd's crude behavior and had no interest whatsoever in speaking with him. Instead, he demanded Lloyd bring his father immediately. Beside him, Javier quietly simmered with irritation at the Viscount's blatant disrespect. Meanwhile, Lloyd simply pretended not to notice the insult at all. Viscount Lacona's patience finally snapped. Demanding to know whether Lloyd had gone deaf, he furiously repeated his order to bring Baron Frontera before him immediately. In response, Lloyd casually cleaned his ears and calmly remarked that his hearing was perfectly fine. The Viscount's voice had merely sounded like the annoying buzzing of some irritating fly. Completely missing the insult, the Viscount instinctively began looking around in confusion, genuinely trying to locate the supposed fly. Only after the knight beside him whispered the truth into his ear did the Viscount realize Lloyd had just mocked him directly. His face instantly twisted in outrage. But before he could explode further, Lloyd calmly began reciting legal statutes, specifically the Kingdom's Land Act, Title 321, the special exemption concerning the development of barren land. The Viscount immediately became flustered and attempted to interrupt him, but Lloyd gave him absolutely no room to speak. Without pause, Lloyd continued citing the law flawlessly. According to Clause 2, barren land referred to any territory abandoned for over 100 years without cultivation or residential activity. The Viscount weakly tried protesting again, asking Lloyd to stop and listen for a moment. But Lloyd completely overwhelmed him with non-stop explanation before he could even finish a sentence. Clause 3 determined ownership rights. Any barren land developed through personal investment and labor would legally belong to the individual responsible for reclaiming it. Then Lloyd began listing the conditions one by one. The land needed to be developed with clear purpose through labor and capital investment. It needed to support residential structures. It needed to sustain long-term agricultural activity. And finally, Lloyd stepped forward while lifting freshly harvested crops into the air. The land needed to successfully produce at least one legally recognized harvest. The Viscount completely froze. Frustration spread visibly across his face as the reality of the situation finally sank in. Nearby, Javier stared in disbelief. Earlier, Lloyd had suddenly forced him to plant seeds immediately without explanation. At the time, Javier assumed Lloyd was merely creating more pointless work for him as usual. Only now did Javier finally realize the real purpose behind it all. Lloyd had planned this entire counterattack in advance. A massive grin spread across Lloyd's face as he cheerfully congratulated the Viscount on witnessing the historic first harvest of the Merit's wetlands. Then, acting absurdly generous, Lloyd added that there would naturally be no admission fee for such an honor. Inside, the Viscount boiled with rage. Where had this monstrous brat even come from? Had Lloyd truly calculated everything this far ahead? Meanwhile, Lloyd casually offered the harvested crop toward him like a friendly gift. Then his expression suddenly turned ice cold. Quietly, Lloyd asked the Viscount to kindly remove himself from his land. The Viscount's face darkened completely. Unable to refute a single word legally, he could only glare furiously at Lloyd before turning around and leaving alongside his men in bitter silence. Not even a final protest escaped him. Once they disappeared, Javier quietly asked Lloyd whether he had somehow foreseen their arrival through a prophecy or something similar. Lloyd immediately scoffed at the idea. This simply was not his first time dealing with parasites like them, leeches trying to steal the results of someone else's hard work. The instant the Viscount finally disappeared from sight, loud cheers erupted across the wetlands. The workers and townspeople celebrated wildly, praising Lloyd for protecting the land and saving the future of the territory. Lloyd turned toward the cheering crowd with a tired sigh. Then, returning to his usual rough attitude, he loudly demanded whether any of them were being paid to stand around cheering for him. Immediately afterward, he ordered everyone back to work. The Frontera Baroni, a rural province in the eastern region of the kingdom, stood on the verge of witnessing the grand finale of the greatest construction project in its history. Yet none of its people realized the truth. They did not know that the construction was far from over. What they believed to be the end was merely the beginning of an even greater transformation, and Lloyd had no intention of stopping there. Summer faded, and autumn arrived with relentless rain. Beneath the pouring skies, Lloyd remained at the site, drenched but patient. Deep within, he reminded himself that despite running hundreds of simulations, there was no room for complacency. He needed to stay until the very end and confirm whether the Merit's wetlands could truly serve a greater purpose. Time passed. The rain finally ceased, and sunlight poured over the land once more. The barren wasteland that had once seemed hopeless now shimmered with promise. At that moment, system messages appeared before Lloyd, announcing that he had achieved a monumental accomplishment in construction and had left an indelible mark on the history of civil engineering across the Laurasia continent. As a reward, he received an enormous amount of skill experience. Alongside it came several newly acquired skills, while the approval ratings of the Baron and several important figures rose significantly. Lloyd's face lit up with satisfaction as he declared that the work was finally complete and that it was time to move on to the next stage. The very next day, the Frontera Barony officially announced the Reclaim Merit's land migration plan. The moment Viscount Lacona heard the details of the plan created by his northern neighbor, he violently hurled the onion piece he had been fiddling with straight into the wall. His administrator explained that the reclaimed land was being distributed for free, with settlers receiving complete protection for 3 years. However, in exchange, they would be required to live there for 5 years, and migration would remain restricted during that period. The Viscount exploded in frustration as he realized the residents would spend the final 2 years aggressively cultivating the land. Inside, fury and jealousy churned violently within him. He understood that those settlers would eventually become true landowners, and the Merit's wetlands would transform into a golden goose, endlessly laying golden eggs. The realization tormented him. Half of that land had once belonged to him, and the thought of surrendering such fertile territory so easily filled him with unbearable resentment. Unable to contain himself any longer, the Viscount roared for his administrator. The administrator immediately responded to his lord's call. Slamming the table with explosive force, the Viscount ordered him to summon the supervisor of the dye workshop at once. The following morning arrived quietly. Lloyd rose from bed with a groan, clutching his pounding head. His entire body felt unbearably heavy, as though massive stones had been tied to his limbs. Confidentially, he wondered if the endless days of labor had finally caught up to him. Even so, he refused to stay in bed. There were still sections to organize and distribution allotments to manage. Despite the throbbing pain, Lloyd called out for Javier and told him to get up because he was heading back to work. Javier slowly opened his eyes with a deep frown etched across his face. Lloyd noticed his exhausted expression and questioned whether Javier was suffering from the same fatigue. While holding his head, Javier admitted that he had never experienced such a severe headache before. And the problem was not limited to them alone. Ms. Emily, one of the maids serving at the Baron's estate, apologized weakly and explained that she had been suffering from a terrible headache since early morning. A village farmer named Mr. Allop revealed that it was not only him experiencing the symptoms. His wife and even his young children were suffering from the same headache as well. Michael, the farm boy responsible for the cows, reported with concern that the animals had stopped drinking water since the previous day, and if the situation continued, they would eventually become dehydrated. As Lloyd walked through the village observing the situation, a grim realization formed within his mind. The strange condition was affecting everyone in the village, and even the animals were deliberately avoiding the water. Deep within, Lloyd realized his suspicions had been correct from the very beginning. The water itself was causing the problem. One of the greatest weapons he possessed in this world was his knowledge of the original novel, yet after the incident involving the wild ants, he had learned that certain events existed beyond the story's pages. He had already anticipated that Viscount Lacona would eventually attempt to reclaim the Merit's wetlands, so he had secretly investigated the people of the Lacona region and uncovered a crucial detail. Their greatest source of income came from their mysterious dyeing technology, and the Lacona berries used in the dye production possessed dangerous properties. The realization filled Lloyd with boiling rage. Grinding his teeth violently, he cursed Viscount Lacona with burning hatred. Meanwhile, inside the Baron's mansion, a visitor from Lacona County arrived with a proposal. The Baron immediately reacted with disbelief and demanded clarification regarding what the man truly meant. Sir Curno calmly explained that the offer was quite simple. If the Frontera family surrendered half of the reclaimed Merit's wetlands, Lacona County would stop dumping dye wastewater into their river. The Baron's face twisted with fury as he declared that such actions amounted to nothing less than blackmail. Curno answered without hesitation, openly admitting that it was indeed blackmail. The Baron slammed both hands onto the table and furiously demanded whether Lacona feared the law at all. He threatened to bring the matter before the king's court personally. Curno remained completely composed and even encouraged him to proceed, admitting that the Baron would likely win the trial in the end. Then a smug smile spread across his face as he explained the true problem. The legal battle would take at least 2 years to conclude, and during that time, the Frontera barony would be forced to endure crushing legal fees while also securing entirely new sources of drinking water. He questioned whether the Baron could survive such losses for that long. The Baron burned with anger, yet no response came to mind. Satisfied, Curno rose from his seat and announced that he looked forward to the Baron making a wise decision. Suppressing the fury boiling inside him, the Baron slowly lifted his head and glared at Sir Curno. He declared that his son and his people had poured their blood and sweat into reclaiming that land, and he swore that he would never surrender even a single inch of it to trash like him. Curno merely smirked before bowing politely and turning to leave. At that exact moment, the office door burst open with a violent slam. Curno was instantly crushed sideways as Lloyd barged into the room alongside Javier. Lloyd urgently informed the Baron that he had discovered their parasitic neighbors had been tampering with the river water and wished to discuss countermeasures immediately. From behind him, Curno clutched his aching head and furiously demanded whether Lloyd had just insulted his master. Startled, Lloyd jerked back dramatically and exclaimed in shock that he had no idea parasite scum could actually understand human language. Curno's face distorted with rage as veins bulged across his forehead. In one swift motion, he unsheathed his sword and pointed it directly at Lloyd, declaring that Lloyd Frontera had insulted a knight's honor twice. He formally challenged him to a duel in the name of Cournot. The duel began almost immediately in the backyard. Lloyd mercilessly battered Sir Curno from every direction with his shovel. The knight quickly broke down into desperate pleas, yielding repeatedly while begging for mercy through tears. Only then did Lloyd finally stop and take a deep breath, announcing that he was now satisfied. But the very next moment, he resumed smashing Curno again, declaring that this beating was punishment for disrespecting the Baron. Sir Curno's screams echoed miserably through the estate as he desperately begged Lloyd to stop hitting him. The Baron shouted that the duel had already ended and demanded to know what Lloyd thought he was doing. Yet privately, the Baron could barely contain his delight. A massive grin spread across his face as he watched the scene unfold. Javier quietly observed the Baron in astonishment, realizing he had never seen him look this pleased before. Once everything was finally over, Sir Curno returned to Lacona County bruised, battered, and utterly humiliated, where he reported the entire ordeal to the Viscount. Viscount Lacona erupted in fury the moment he heard Curno's report. He roared that he had sent him there to blackmail the Frontera family, not to return after getting beaten senseless. Curno immediately dropped into apology and begged forgiveness from his lord. rude. But suddenly, the Viscount calmed himself. After a brief pause, his expression slowly shifted and he unexpectedly praised Curnow for doing well. Curnow stared at him in complete confusion. The Viscount explained that the Baron's only real option had been to bring the matter before the courts. However, thanks to the incident, Lacona County could now twist the situation into a case of assault committed by a reckless aristocrat. A sinister grin stretched across his lips as he gleefully calculated that the additional accusations could drag the legal process out by another 3 or even 4 years. The thought delighted him so much that loud, villainous laughter burst from his mouth. At that exact same time, inside the Frontera estate, Lloyd wore an almost identical expression. A wicked grin spread across his face as he laughed just as maliciously, having already predicted every step Viscount Lacona intended to take next. The following day, Lloyd stood atop the rooftop and delivered a thunderous speech that echoed across the estate. He openly declared that the Viscount was undoubtedly expecting the Frontera barony to waste itself fighting in court, but they would never choose such a foolish path. Instead, they would overwhelm Lacona through their own means. The people of the barony had reclaimed that land through blood, sweat, and tears, and now they would protect it from the greed threatening to steal it away. The villagers exploded into deafening cheers, their excitement shaking the surroundings. Meanwhile, Lloyd had already organized the next stage of his plan inside his mind. The first priority was solving the drinking water crisis by constructing a reservoir. Hamong would transport clean water from upstream before the river became contaminated. Javier acknowledged that it was an effective temporary solution, but warned that neither Lloyd nor Hamong would have a single day of rest if they continued operating like this. Lloyd immediately agreed. This was only a temporary measure. What he truly intended to build was a complete water supply system capable of drawing fresh water all the way from Lake Kapua in the eastern mountains. Javier pointed out the enormous distance involved and the absurd amount of labor such a project would require. Lloyd casually admitted that the undertaking would indeed result in massive losses at first. However, privately, he was already imagining the enormous construction fees he would eventually secure from the project, dreaming not of tenfold profit, but 100-fold return. Only a few months later, Lloyd's plans unfolded exactly as he had predicted. The news spread like wildfire across the region, and Viscount Lacona was thrown into complete disbelief as every scheme he had carefully prepared collapsed before his eyes. Breathing heavily in shock, he repeatedly questioned how such a thing could possibly happen. At that moment, the administrator entered and informed him that the eldest son of Baron Frontera was requesting an audience. The Viscount instantly shouted that he was busy and ordered them to be thrown out. However, the administrator carefully added that the visitors claimed they had come to help resolve some of the Viscount's current problems. The moment he heard that, the Viscount immediately ordered them to be led inside. Without hesitation, Lloyd entered the room wearing his usual swagger and shamelessly cocky smile, while Javier stood silently behind him. Lloyd cheerfully remarked that the Viscount appeared to be doing remarkably well. The Viscount, already shaken, nervously demanded to know what Lloyd wanted. Lloyd innocently questioned whether he had not heard properly, reminding him that they had come specifically to help solve his problems. Irritated, the Viscount snapped back that he had no problems whatsoever, but Lloyd continued pressing him with a smug expression, suggesting that perhaps he could help save the Viscount's collapsing dye workshop. The Viscount's face twisted with rage as realization finally struck him. He accused Lloyd of being responsible for ruining the entire dye workshop operation. Wearing a sinister grin, Lloyd admitted that it had taken quite a bit of effort. Thanks to the wastewater Lacona County had dumped into the Frontera water supply, they had been forced to bring clean water all the way from Lake Kapua, casually explaining that at first, the Frontera barony had no idea Lacona County had been dumping wastewater into the river. Fortunately, Sir Curnow had been kind enough to personally reveal that the contamination had been intentional all along. He leisurely continued his explanation, describing how they had dug a route from Lake Kapua to their territory, laid down pipes, buried them underground, and endured all sorts of exhausting labor in the process. Unable to tolerate the rambling any longer, the Viscount slammed his fist against the table and demanded that Lloyd stop wasting time and explain what exactly he had done to the dye workshop. Lloyd merely blinked innocently and remarked that the Viscount was far too impatient. Calmly, he resumed the story. At one point during construction, they encountered an enormous valley blocking the route. Since there had supposedly been no other option available, they had no choice but to construct a Roman-style aqueduct capable of carrying water across the valley. The construction required blasting massive amounts of limestone to use as building material. During the process, some of that limestone accidentally spread across the valley floor, exposing large sections of limestone bedrock beneath it as well. The Viscount exploded again, screaming that none of this explained what had happened to his dye workshop. Completely unfazed, Lloyd finally delivered the answer. The water flowing through that valley eventually reached the Viscount's workshop, and the lime mixed into the water had completely ruined the dyeing process, turning every dyed cloth into worthless garbage. The Viscount lost all restraint. Clutching the table violently, he shouted that Lloyd had gone too far and demanded whether he feared the law at all. He swore that he would sue him at the royal court. Lloyd simply tilted his head and encouraged him to do exactly that. He calmly reminded the Viscount that a verdict would take at least 2 years to reach, then quietly questioned whether anyone would still remember Lacona's products by that point. The Viscount's face instantly drained of color as sweat poured down his skin. Inside, rage consumed him as he cursed Lloyd as a sneaky, worthless scoundrel. Meanwhile, Lloyd casually turned around and announced that since he had now thoroughly answered all the Viscount's concerns regarding his problems, he would be taking his leave. The Viscount furiously screamed after him, warning that he had chosen the wrong enemy. He boasted about his countless connections within the royal court and swore he would make Lloyd repay the damages many times over. Lloyd did not even bother looking back. He simply waved his hand dismissively and exited the residence. As they walked outside, Javier admitted that there was still something he did not understand. Lloyd asked what was bothering him. Javier explained that all Lloyd had truly done was provoke and enrage the Viscount even further. In his eyes, Lacona would now fight the legal battle until the bitter end, especially since the Viscount genuinely possessed many powerful connections within the capital. If the conflict escalated into court, the costs would only grow greater. Lloyd casually brushed aside the concern, saying he already understood exactly what Javier meant. With complete confidence, he told him to simply wait and see who truly had more to lose. And just as Lloyd had predicted, only a month later the situation completely reversed. Viscount Lacona personally arrived at the Frontera estate and collapsed flat onto the ground, desperately begging for mercy. He admitted his wrongdoing and pleaded for Lloyd to save his dye workshop. Lloyd, still carrying his usual swagger, mockingly questioned whether all of the Viscount's prestigious connections had informed him that winning the lawsuit was impossible. The Viscount confessed that he had acted foolishly and repeatedly apologized with deep desperation. Lloyd responded with fake sympathy, remarking that apologies held no value to him. The Viscount, now sobbing openly, pointed out that despite being a Viscount, he had cast aside his pride and lowered himself to beg personally. Lloyd sneered at the mention of pride. To him, pride was not even worth 1/10 of a gold piece. If it truly had any value at all, he claimed he would gladly sell it away 1,000, no, even 10,000 times over. What he wanted was not an apology. Leaning closer with a sly smile, Lloyd finally revealed his true objective. All he desired was a simple signature on a water supply contract between the Frontera Baroni and the Viscounty of Lacona. Once signed, Frontera would begin supplying clean water to the dye workshop within a single week. The Viscount stared blankly at the contract in utter disbelief after reading the terms. He shouted that the price was absurdly high and demanded how anyone could possibly put a price on water itself. At that moment, Lloyd's expression darkened completely. Coldly, he pointed out the irony. The very person who had taught him that water was never free had been the Viscount himself. The Viscount's heart sank heavily. Distress completely overtook his face as he reluctantly signed the papers. A short while later, Lloyd returned to report everything to the Baron and proudly presented the signed contract. The Baron stared at the contract in disbelief and questioned whether they were truly going to receive such an enormous sum every single month. Lloyd confidently confirmed that it was all real and reminded him that the Viscount had personally signed the agreement himself. The Baron stated that with this amount of money, they would finally be able to repay all the interest on their debts and still have more than enough left over. In his excitement, he even praised the Viscount's unbelievable generosity. At those words, Lloyd's face slowly twisted into a dark and sinister smile. Privately, he admitted that although the Viscount had been the one to start this entire conflict, the outcome had ultimately benefited both the people of the barony and the Baron himself. But then Lloyd's thoughts grew even darker. A cruel expression spread across his face as he realized the true beauty of the contract. There was no expiration date written anywhere within it. That meant the Frontera family would continue draining the Viscount dry for the rest of his life. No, even after his death, they would continue sucking his bloodline dry for generations to come. To Lloyd, allowing the Viscount to escape with only minor losses was unacceptable. If it were possible to exchange blood vessels directly for money, he would have gladly ripped every last one out himself. The thought filled him with horrifying delight as wicked laughter brewed within him. The Baron, however, suddenly brought up another matter. He mentioned that he had additional good news to share, but then paused after noticing Lloyd's terrifying expression and admitted that his face was genuinely frightening him. Lloyd instantly corrected his expression and awkwardly apologized, claiming he was simply too happy about the contract. The Baron then revealed that Count Cremo had sent word regarding the old battered treasure Lloyd had obtained from the Orc tribe. Apparently, the Count wished to purchase it for an impressive amount of money. Lloyd found the situation strange. A powerful noble like Count Cremo could easily afford to buy brand new artifacts of that quality, so he could not understand why he would specifically want those worn out pieces. The Baron admitted he did not know the full details either, but according to the message, Count Cremo intended to use them for constructing a statue. Meanwhile, far away in Cremo, the great city of commerce, a heavy gloom hung over the atmosphere. Count Cremo stood silently beside a window, staring out into the night with deep concern etched across his face. Outside, the river flowed quietly beneath the pale moonlight. Yet something felt terribly wrong. Suddenly, the calm surface of the water violently exploded apart. A monstrous figure tore upward from the river depths, followed by a deafening roar that shook the surroundings. Beneath the moonlight, a gigantic creature slowly revealed itself, its enormous crimson eyes locked onto the city with terrifying intensity. It was the monster Giga Titan. Inside the Frontera estate, Javier informed the Baron that they would be departing in 1 week. By then, the waterworks in Lacona would likely be completed. In order to reduce expenses as much as possible, Lloyd intended to bring only around 10 men along for the journey. The Baron quietly acknowledged the decision, saying that if it was truly what Lloyd wanted, then he would allow it. For a brief moment, silence settled between them. Javier understood the reason behind the Baron's hesitation without needing it explained. Breaking the silence, Javier reassured him that there was no need to worry, as he would personally monitor Lloyd closely. The Baron slowly reflected on the recent events. When the knight from Viscount Lacona had arrived to blackmail him into surrendering half of the reclaimed Maritz Wetlands, the old him would have trembled in fear and simply handed everything over without resistance. Yet after witnessing the tireless efforts of Lloyd and the people of the barony, he had finally discovered courage within himself. With quiet self-awareness, the Baron admitted that he had always considered himself indecisive and incompetent as a lord. Javier immediately tried to deny those words. In his eyes, the Baron had always been the kindest and warmest person he had ever known. The Baron smiled softly in response and thanked him for the sentiment, but he still could not call himself a truly good ruler because of kindness alone. A proper leader needed firm principles and the resolve to act decisively. Just like Lloyd, Javier fell silent. Inside, he could not help thinking that Lloyd's only real principle in life was money. Yet as the thought lingered, uncertainty quietly followed. Was pursuing money truly such a terrible thing? At this point, even Javier no longer knew the answer. The Baron then gave Javier a new command. His duty was no longer to monitor Lloyd. From this point onward, he was to protect Lloyd as the rightful heir of the land. Javier bowed respectfully and accepted the order, yet privately, he still believed he could never truly like Lloyd Frontera, no matter how miraculously the man had restored the Baron's fortunes. Old memories suddenly resurfaced in his mind. Back when Javier had still been a child, the Baron had once gently asked him what he wished to become in the future. He had even promised to help however he could. Young Javier had answered with complete sincerity that he wanted to become a knight and protect his lord. The Baron had warmly brushed his hair and laughed proudly, praising the boy for surviving the brutal winter all alone. He confidently declared that Javier would one day become the world's strongest knight. Then the Baron personally gifted him a wooden sword he had carved himself. That wooden sword had become Javier's greatest treasure, but another memory immediately followed. The young Lloyd Frontera had mocked Javier mercilessly, laughing at the idea that an orphan like him could ever become a knight. Then without hesitation, Lloyd had crushed the wooden sword beneath his foot. Javier shook the unpleasant memories away and returned to his chamber. As he removed his coat, his gaze drifted toward the wall. There, hanging silently, was that same broken wooden sword. Looking at it once again, Javier quietly reaffirmed that he could never truly like Lloyd. And yet sitting inside the room was Lloyd himself. With exaggerated enthusiasm, Lloyd welcomed Javier back like a loyal customer returning to a business establishment. He proudly thanked him for once again using the Frontera lullaby services and smugly claimed that Javier could no longer live without him. Lloyd even jokingly warned that if Javier refused to cooperate, his services might suddenly be suspended. Javier simply sat down with his pillow tucked beneath his arm and dryly remarked that Lloyd repeated the same nonsense every single time. He urged him to stop wasting time and begin already. Lloyd immediately launched into another endless stream of civil engineering and construction knowledge. To anyone else, the rambling would have sounded like incomprehensible gibberish, but for Javier, it had become the perfect cure for his insomnia. As Javier slowly drifted towards sleep, conflicting thoughts stirred deep within him. He was certain he should hate Lloyd, yet lately, Lloyd felt like an entirely different person from the one he remembered. The realization disturbed him so much that he began hating himself for even considering that Lloyd might actually be a decent man. The night grew darker, and eventually both Lloyd and Javier fell into deep sleep. Then, without warning, the window slowly creaked open. An intruder slipped silently into the room, radiating murderous intent. It was Sir Curno, grinding his teeth in pure rage. Curno unsheathed his blade and fixed his eyes on Lloyd. Inside, hatred consumed him as he blamed Lloyd for everything that had happened to him. Under the pale moonlight, Curno lunged forward. His blade descended directly toward the sleeping Lloyd. But at that exact instant, Javier's senses screamed in alarm. His eyes snapped open and he instantly dashed forward. Javier's sword collided against Curno's blade before it could pierce Lloyd. Curno's eyes widened in shock as his weapon shattered apart instantly, breaking cleanly into two pieces. The sudden impact jolted Lloyd awake. Still half asleep, he looked downward in confusion and saw Javier pinning Curno against the ground with overwhelming force while locking his arm completely in place. The following morning, work at the construction site proceeded as usual. Lloyd loudly asked the workers what the most important thing always was. The workers answered in perfect unison that safety always came first. As the shouting settled, Javier approached Lloyd and informed him that they had handed the intruder back over to Viscount Lacona. Lloyd casually praised the effort. Javier then mentioned that Curno had targeted Lloyd because... But Lloyd immediately interrupted, already understanding the entire situation. Since the Viscount had been forced to spend enormous sums on water, he had most likely fired Curno first. Lloyd openly admitted that he would have done the same thing. In his eyes, Curno had been an expensive knight whose only achievement was repeatedly getting beaten up by the neighboring brat. Seeking revenge afterward was exactly the sort of petty thinking Lloyd expected from small-minded people. Javier asked whether that meant Lloyd had anticipated an attack like this. Lloyd answered that he had not predicted it exactly, though he had assumed something similar could happen eventually. Javier pointed out that failing to prepare proper precautions despite suspecting danger had been careless. Yet privately, confusion stirred inside him. Lloyd normally planned ahead for every possible outcome, so Javier could not understand why he had acted so casually this time. Lloyd suddenly turned toward him and questioned what precautions he could possibly need when Javier himself was already standing beside him. The words caught Javier completely off guard. Lloyd calmly continued, explaining that Javier's presence alone allowed him to move around freely without worry. He trusted Javier because he was exceptionally capable. Lloyd then pointed out something Javier himself rarely considered. A 5-year-old child who had lost his entire village during a monster attack should never have survived a brutal winter alone. Yet Javier had endured it and grown into the knight standing before him today. To Lloyd, there was nothing more dependable than that. Javier stood frozen in disbelief. How could this possibly be the same Lloyd Frontera he once knew? The hooligan he remembered could never have spoken like this. Meanwhile, Lloyd awkwardly scratched at the atmosphere and admitted that the situation was becoming unbearably embarrassing. He urged Javier to say something quickly because he was already regretting how cringeworthy his own words sounded. Javier simply looked away in silence. Lloyd immediately burst into laughter and patted his shoulder, declaring that such a reaction was perfectly fitting for Javier. But within Javier's heart, the same uncomfortable thought resurfaced again. He truly hated himself for believing that Lloyd might actually be a decent man. At that moment, system messages appeared inside Lloyd's mind, announcing that Javier Azrahan had finally begun letting go of his long-held resentment. As a reward for drastically improving their relationship, Lloyd received 320 RP. Completely satisfied, Lloyd announced that the waterworks would be finished by the following day, and after that they would head to Cremo. The following day, Lloyd departed for Cremo, the great city of commerce, alongside his companions. During the journey, Lloyd sat behind Javier while constantly dozing off on horseback. His head repeatedly fell onto Javier's shoulder, much to Javier's growing irritation. Eventually, Javier abruptly jerked his shoulder upward, striking Lloyd directly beneath the chin. Lloyd immediately jolted awake and suspiciously demanded to know whether Javier had just hit him. Javier calmly denied everything. Still unconvinced, Lloyd insisted that he definitely felt it. Javier dryly pointed out that Lloyd had not actually seen him do anything. Lloyd immediately began accusing him anyway. Deep down, he was certain Javier had been silently mocking him for being unable to ride a horse properly while falling asleep like an idiot during the journey. Lloyd became completely convinced that Javier had deliberately attacked him out of annoyance. Javier sarcastically remarked that Lloyd apparently possessed the ability to read minds now. Lloyd instantly jumped on the statement and triumphantly claimed it was proof that Javier had admitted to hitting him. Without changing expression, Javier denied it once again and insisted he would never dream of doing such a thing. Completely unsatisfied, Lloyd declared Javier unbelievably petty before suddenly ordering the entire group to stop. He hurriedly climbed down from the horse and demanded that Javier teach him how to ride properly. Javier flatly refused, reminding Lloyd that he was a knight, not some horse riding instructor. But Lloyd immediately threw around his authority and declared it an order. Clicking his tongue in irritation, Javier reluctantly dismounted as well, while privately grumbling about how petty Lloyd truly was. Lloyd instantly demanded to know what Javier had just muttered. At that exact moment, the system suddenly translated Javier's complaint in the most absurd way possible, claiming Javier had actually thanked Lloyd warmly and praised him as a kind-hearted angel with a pure soul. Lloyd exploded in frustration and screamed at the nonsense translator to shut up and disappear already. Javier narrowed his eyes in confusion and questioned what had suddenly gone wrong with him. From Javier's perspective, Lloyd had started yelling at thin air without warning. Before Lloyd could even respond, another system message appeared. It informed him that rumors regarding the construction of the continent's very first waterworks were spreading rapidly. His reputation as an engineer had risen dramatically, and his name would now be remembered throughout the kingdom and across the continent's construction history. As a reward, he received an additional 600 RP. Inside, Lloyd nearly exploded with joy. To him, this was the ultimate jackpot. Greater reputation meant access to even larger construction projects in the future, and larger projects meant greater profits. Greater profits meant achieving the sweet retirement life he dreamed of. A glorious golden future filled with money seemed to spread before his eyes, causing evil laughter to erupt within him. Watching the sudden emotional roller coaster, Javier dryly questioned whether Lloyd had completely lost his mind, considering he had gone from furious to hysterically happy in mere seconds. The system immediately translated Javier's thoughts again, bluntly declaring that Lloyd really had lost his mind. Lloyd cursed the system messages once more in frustration, and with that, the group resumed their journey. The road to Cremo was extremely long, and as they traveled onward, winter steadily approached. By the time they finally arrived, midwinter had already settled over the land. The city of Cremo overwhelmed the delegation immediately. The entire place resembled a chaotic mixture of countless different cultures and influences, all tangled together like a massive bowl of bibimbap. The sheer atmosphere left everyone stunned. After navigating through the bustling city, Lloyd and Javier eventually arrived to meet Count Cremo. The Count warmly thanked them for making the long journey and introduced himself as the Lord governing the city. Lloyd respectfully bowed and humbly introduced himself as a member of the Frontera family. But before Lloyd could even finish properly, Count Cremo burst into laughter and admitted that Lloyd looked nothing like he had imagined. After hearing rumors about Lloyd being a talented builder, he had expected someone rough and rugged. Instead, Lloyd possessed an unexpectedly noble appearance. Then, without hesitation, Count Cremo completely walked past Lloyd and approached Javier instead. The Count stared at Javier in admiration and remarked that he looked nobler than nobles themselves. According to him, Javier's appearance was refined enough that he could easily pass as royalty. Laughing enthusiastically, Count Cremo even asked whether Javier happened to already have a fiancé. Lloyd awkwardly tried to interrupt and call out to the Count, but Count Cremo ignored him entirely and casually suggested that if Javier was unmarried, perhaps he should consider marrying the Count's daughter instead. Lloyd attempted to interrupt again. This time, Count Cremo suddenly turned toward Lloyd and loudly scolded him for daring to interrupt a conversation between nobles despite being nothing more than a servant. Lloyd froze in complete shock, utterly unable to process what had just happened. And to make matters worse, the system immediately added insult to injury by mockingly laughing at Lloyd's servant face. Eventually, after the chaotic introduction finally settled down, everyone took their seats. Count Cremo burst into even louder laughter, delighted by the misunderstanding he had caused. He then apologized sincerely for the misunderstanding and assured Lloyd that he had never intended any offense. Meanwhile, Lloyd sat there with his head lowered, quietly insisting that everything was fine. Naturally, the system immediately made things worse by mockingly translating Lloyd's thoughts as if he were blaming his own face for the entire situation before bursting into shameless laughter. Inside, Lloyd boiled with murderous intent toward the system and wished he could beat it senseless. But Count Cremo only continued laughing and jokingly added that the misunderstanding was partially Lloyd's fault as well, considering he had apparently been born with the face of a servant. Deep down, Lloyd desperately begged everyone around him to stop humiliating him already. Still, despite his ridiculous personality, Count Cremo remained an extremely important figure within the world of the Knight of Blood and Iron. In the original story, Javier eventually became a wanted criminal after beheading the moneylenders Shiloh and Meatloaf. Forced into hiding, he would later end up arrested by Count Cremo inside the city. However, Count Cremo would recognize Javier's integrity and character after only a brief interaction and would go on to support him in many ways afterward. Shifting the conversation back to business, Count Cremo explained that he wished to purchase Lloyd's jewels because he intended to use them as decorations for a statue that would be erected out in the sea. Lloyd immediately questioned why anyone would place a statue in the middle of the ocean. Count Cremo let out a heavy sigh before revealing the city's current crisis. Trade in Cremo had been steadily declining for several years. The cause was a Giga Titan that had begun appearing off the coast near the port. Although the creature had never directly attacked the city, its mere existence terrified merchants and sailors enough to damage commerce severely. Upon hearing that explanation, memories resurfaced within Lloyd's mind. He vaguely remembered reading about this incident in the novel. Since the monster remained in the water, even the Navy had no reliable method of attacking it. As a result, Cremo's economy gradually deteriorated while the Count struggled desperately to find a solution. What irritated Lloyd even more was remembering how the original story handled the situation. The narrative had heavily implied that Javier would eventually resolve the crisis, only for the entire subplot to suddenly disappear without proper explanation. The story had ended the arc with nothing but frustrating bait, and there had not even been confirmation of another season afterward. When Lloyd first arrived in this world, he had believed he understood everything through the novel's knowledge, but now he realized that even the unfinished and unexplored parts of the story were continuing to unfold naturally beyond what had ever been written. Count Cremo then revealed the conclusion he had reached after extensive research into the Giga Titan. He had discovered the existence of mermaids, the terrifying warrior race that ruled the seas. According to the information he gathered, the Giga Titan possessed deep fear toward mermaids and even reacted fearfully toward things resembling them. That discovery inspired his idea. He planned to construct a giant mermaid statue within the sea itself in hopes of scaring the monster away. However, Count Cremo admitted that he had ultimately abandoned the idea. Lloyd immediately questioned why. The Count explained that building a structure like that would require raising the seabed itself. If they did so, the surrounding waters would become too shallow for ships to pass through properly. Hearing the explanation, Lloyd fell into deep thought. From an engineering perspective, he knew Count Cremo's reasoning was completely correct. Count Cremo calmly assured Lloyd that there was no need to worry. Even though the statue project had become useless to him now, he still intended to purchase the jewels because he had already made a promise. But Lloyd immediately refused to let him suffer such a pointless loss. Count Cremo looked puzzled and questioned whether that meant Lloyd no longer intended to sell the treasure. Lloyd quickly clarified that he absolutely intended to sell it, and preferably for a very high price. The Count grew even more confused. Then Lloyd confidently declared that he would personally construct the mermaid statue as well, all while ensuring that the sea channels and water levels remained completely undisturbed. Deep inside, Lloyd's mind was already racing through engineering concepts, friction piles combined with box caissons. If those two methods were properly integrated, constructing artificial ground beneath the sea was entirely possible, and with that realization, Lloyd immediately began preparing for the project. It was time to conduct a full survey. The waves along the coast crashed steadily against the harbor as Lloyd and Javier boarded a rough wooden boat out at sea. Leaning over the edge, Lloyd inhaled deeply before placing a bizarre pair of goggles over his face that resembled oversized soap containers. Then he thrust his head directly into the freezing seawater. While surveying the seabed, Lloyd carefully observed the underwater terrain. Fortunately, the seabed appeared relatively flat, layered with thick sediment that possessed just the right softness for construction. As for the bedrock lying deeper below, well, that part did not matter too much. The icy seawater pressed painfully against his face, and before long, Lloyd could no longer endure the freezing cold. He violently jerked his head back out of the water. His face had turned bright red, and his teeth chattered uncontrollably like a shivering frog. Watching the miserable sight, Javier could not suppress a smirk. Lloyd immediately demanded to know why he suddenly looked so pleased. Javier calmly apologized and admitted that it was the first time in his life that watching someone suffer had brought him genuine happiness. The words pierced Lloyd directly in the heart as he stared at Javier in disbelief. Without another word, Lloyd immediately shoved the measuring duties onto him instead. Javier casually changed the topic and asked whether the contract for the project was truly acceptable. Lloyd instantly accused him of trying to dodge the conversation. Ignoring that complaint entirely, Javier admitted that every time Lloyd explained these ideas, he still found them impossible to imagine. Building land vertically upward from the seabed sounded absurd, unless Lloyd intended to use actual magic. Lloyd paused briefly before replying that perhaps it really could be called magic. The magic of cement. Secretly, a grin spread across his mind as another thought surfaced. The real challenge was figuring out how to create cement in this world. But if Roman-style cement was possible, then there was definitely hope. Before either of them realized it, the boat had already reached the pier. Javier stood up first and extended his hand toward Lloyd while dryly warning him not to lose his footing and fall. Lloyd immediately complained that Javier's sarcasm had already reached the level of a sword master and questioned whether he had secretly become a banter master instead. The moment Lloyd and Javier stepped off the boat onto the pier, a soft and gentle voice greeted them. A beautiful young lady stood waiting by the seaside. She timidly asked whether one of them was Master Lloyd Frontera because she had something she wished to give him. Lloyd immediately tilted his head in confusion while his heart began fluttering wildly. The young woman introduced herself as Christine, the daughter of Count Cremo. She shyly explained that she had seen him walking through the mansion courtyard the previous day. Then, with her cheeks turning bright pink, Christine lowered her head in embarrassment. Meanwhile, Lloyd's heart rate skyrocketed. Sweat poured down his face as excitement completely overwhelmed him. Gathering her courage, Christine gently kissed the letter in her hands before suddenly thrusting it forward and pleading for him to accept it. Unfortunately for Lloyd, the letter was aimed directly toward Javier. Christine had mistaken Javier for Lloyd the entire time. Lloyd instantly froze as his soul shattered into pieces. Deep down, he bitterly admitted that he had honestly expected something like this to happen anyway. Still, the pain hit harder than he wanted to admit. Meanwhile, Javier casually accepted the love letter without the slightest hesitation and thanked Christine politely like an experienced romantic veteran. Then he smoothly slipped the letter into his pocket as though this sort of thing happened every day. Christine immediately ran off with her companions in absolute delight, celebrating excitedly because Javier had accepted the letter. Soon, only Lloyd and Javier remained standing on the pier while the cold sea breeze swept past them. Javier calmly suggested they continue on their way, but Lloyd immediately snapped and stopped him right there. Completely annoyed, Lloyd exploded in frustration over how naturally Javier was acting, despite what had just happened. Javier simply questioned what exactly Lloyd was talking about. Lloyd angrily pointed out that Javier had accepted the love letter and stored it away as though it were nothing important. Still completely confused, Javier asked what was supposedly wrong with that. An awkward silence followed as the two stared at each other. Then realization finally struck Javier. In complete sincerity, he cautiously asked whether Lloyd had perhaps never received a love letter before. The question stabbed directly into Lloyd's pride. Biting his lips in frustration, Lloyd looked ready to explode on the spot. Meanwhile, Javier genuinely struggled to figure out how to comfort him. Awkwardly, he encouraged Lloyd to stay strong. At that exact moment, the system message appeared once again, cheerfully informing Lloyd that Javier sincerely wished him the best. The message struck Lloyd like a fatal blow to the heart. His face twisted horribly in frustration as emotional damage piled on top of emotional damage. In a fit of rage, Lloyd desperately tried to disable the system messages altogether. Privately, he furiously insisted that he was not jealous in the slightest. None of this mattered because he was going to become rich anyway. He would earn mountains of money, live comfortably, and enjoy an incredible future. Right then, Count Cremo suddenly approached and called out to Lloyd. Lloyd turned around while still wearing the terrifyingly distorted expression of a man suffering catastrophic emotional trauma. The Count nearly recoiled in horror and shouted in shock after seeing Lloyd's face. Realizing the problem, Lloyd instantly forced an exaggerated smile onto his face and awkwardly claimed he had merely been deeply focused on work. Count Cremo admitted that Lloyd had genuinely frightened him for a moment because he looked like someone ready to commit murder. Then the Count shifted back to business and explained that he had managed to gather most of the construction materials Lloyd requested without much trouble. However, obtaining volcanic ash had proven extremely difficult. The moment Lloyd heard that, concern surfaced inside his mind. Volcanic ash was one of the key ingredients required for creating Roman cement, and Roman cement was extraordinary. Its greatest advantage was its absurd durability. Even after 2,000 years, many Roman structures still remain standing in Lloyd's original world. The material's resilience had been unbelievably ahead of its time. Count Cremo explained that obtaining volcanic ash was not impossible, but doing so would require traveling directly to a volcano. Even under the best conditions, the journey alone would consume at least half a year, and he admitted that he simply could not wait that long. Lloyd immediately reassured him not to worry, and confidently declared that he would find another solution somehow. Inside, however, Lloyd instantly switched to a completely different plan. If Roman cement was impossible, then he would attempt to create Portland cement instead. Portland cement had become the foundation of modern construction back in his original world. Although Lloyd only remembered the rough manufacturing process rather than the exact details, he refused to give up. If knowledge alone was not enough, then brute force experimentation would fill the gap. He resolved to test endless combinations until something finally succeeded. And with that determination, Lloyd completely threw himself into experimentation. He abandoned sleep entirely and spent day after day obsessively mixing materials, driven solely by the knowledge and memories from his past life. Yet despite all his efforts, nothing worked. One failed sample followed another endlessly. Lloyd muttered through exhaustion as he reviewed sample number 129, convinced he was close to success. Perhaps the problem lay within the mixing ratios, or maybe the drying process itself was wrong. Already, his mind was preparing dozens of additional combinations and calculations. If he kept increasing the variables, then surely at least one mixture would eventually succeed. Then suddenly, a soft little noise interrupted his thoughts. Lloyd blinked and realized he was no longer alone. Podong had arrived beside him. Not long after, Bangul and Hamang joined in as well. Podong leapt onto Lloyd's shoulder and began shaking his head insistently. Lloyd weakly tried to brush them off, claiming he was too busy and telling them to go on a walk without him. But the summons refused to listen. Bangle and Hamang joined Podong in grabbing onto him and vigorously shaking his head from side to side like a swinging pendulum. Completely distracted from his research, Lloyd finally exploded in frustration and shouted that he was busy. Yet as he stared at the three summons surrounding him, something inside him softened. They reminded him of someone, Gale, his childhood dog from his previous life. But Gale was gone now. Back then, he had cried for days. Gale had been the last remaining member of his family, and endless regrets had consumed him afterward. He wished he had brushed his fur one more time, played with him more, spent more time beside him. The memory struck Lloyd deeply. Suddenly, he tightly embraced his summons and declared that they were far more important than his research ever could be. The three little summons nodded their heads happily. Lloyd scooped them all into his arms and walked away from the forge, stepping out into the cold winter streets by the pier. The chilly sea wind brushed against them quietly. At last, Lloyd admitted the truth to himself. Everything had been going so well lately that he had started treating the summons like nothing more than machines and construction tools. He constantly ordered them around without thinking about their feelings at all. The realization made him feel like the greatest idiot in the world. If something had happened to them, he knew he would have drowned in regret afterward. Kneeling down before them, Lloyd smiled gently and sincerely thanked them for everything they had done. Because Podong, Bangul, and Hamang were not emotionless creatures. They had feelings, and until now, Lloyd had never properly acknowledged that. At that exact moment, a system message suddenly appeared. The fantastical creatures had recognized Lloyd's sincere emotions and now considered him part of their family. Their relationship had evolved beyond a simple master-servant connection and upgraded into something far closer, a true member of their gang. A new upgrade feature for the fantastical creatures had also been unlocked, allowing Lloyd to grant them new skills. Lloyd blinked in shock at the unexpected reward and awkwardly asked the summons whether they had seen the message too. All three enthusiastically nodded together. Bangul especially bounced up and down excitedly while staring at Lloyd with sparkling eyes, desperately insisting that Lloyd choose her first. Lloyd quickly surrendered to the pressure and agreed. Whatever skill she obtained, he was sure he could eventually find some use for it. More importantly, it was clearly what they wanted, and so, with nothing to lose, Lloyd finally selected the menu option, Summon Partner Upgrade. Bangul became enveloped in a mysterious transparent light. A few moments later, the message Lloyd had been waiting for finally appeared before him. The upgrade had succeeded, and as a reward, Bangul had acquired several new skills. Chomping Dirt Level 3, Accelerated Dirt Digestion Level 3, Steel Dung Launcher Level 5, and Volcanic Blast Level 1. Lloyd carefully reread the message before his eyes stopped at the final skill. Deep within, disbelief spread through him at the sight of Volcanic Blast. Bangul's tiny eyes sparkled as if prepared to answer every question he could possibly ask. That same night, Lloyd stopped by the inn, dragged Javier out of sleep, and brought him deep into the empty woods. Eventually, they arrived at a large open plain that Lloyd judged suitable for testing. Bangul slowly raised her tail high into the air. What followed completely exceeded expectations. The ground roared violently as though an actual volcano had erupted beneath them. Magma exploded outward, instantly pulverized into microscopic fragments that scattered into countless volcanic ashes. The eruption did not end after a single blast. The explosion thundered 3 consecutive times before finally dying down. Stunned, Lloyd slapped both palms against his ears while staring at the devastation ahead. Within himself, amazement exploded wildly as he realized the sheer absurdity of Bangul's new ability. Every tree caught within the path of the eruption collapsed one after another like dominoes being swept away. Lloyd burst into loud laughter while excitedly pointing at the destroyed forest and enthusiastically drawing Javier's attention to the overwhelming spectacle before them. To him, Bangul no longer seemed like a mere creature, but an unbelievable gift. Javier remained completely silent. Lloyd repeatedly called out to him, wondering if the explosion had deafened him. Only then did Javier finally respond. Realization struck Lloyd immediately, and he hurriedly apologized for forgetting to warn Javier to cover his ears beforehand. Javier responded with visible confusion, still struggling to hear properly. To test whether Javier's hearing remained intact, Lloyd loudly insulted his appearance. Without hesitation, Javier returned the insult by claiming Lloyd looked even worse. The response instantly exposed the truth. Javier could hear perfectly well and was simply ignoring him. Even so, Javier continued pretending not to hear anything. Despite the ridiculous exchange, Lloyd's excitement refused to fade. Thanks to Bangul, their cement problem had been solved far faster than expected. Privately, Lloyd became even more convinced that speed was the absolute foundation of construction work. The very next day, Lloyd headed toward the dockyard and purchased 5 enormous sail sheets. He then ordered workers to tightly weave them together. His first stage of the plan involved constructing and installing a gigantic diaper-like structure designed to filter volcanic ash. At the far end of the massive diaper, 5 mesh layers were added specifically to capture the ash particles. Soon, Bangul stood wearing a balloon-shaped diaper nearly 98 feet long. Positioned at the center plaza of Cremo City, she devoured massive amounts of earth while violently shaking her body during digestion. The bell attached to her tail suddenly rang. The sound immediately signaled the coming implosion. The instant Lloyd heard it, he cupped his hands around his mouth and screamed at the people gathered throughout the plaza, urgently warning everyone to cover their ears before the blast erupted. An enormous explosion thundered across the area. Count Cremo silently observed the entire scene. Internally, he admitted that Lloyd was far from an ordinary engineer. The bizarre techniques, the summoned creatures, and the entire construction process were unlike anything he had ever witnessed before. Because of that, he resolved to continue monitoring the project closely before later delivering a thorough report directly to the king. Once all the ingredients for cement had been secured, Lloyd immediately moved on to the second stage of construction. The plan was to create a massive caisson, pour the cement into it, place it directly into the sea, and then use Homang's one-shot ability to completely remove the trapped seawater from inside the structure. 2 days later, the next phase began. During that time, Lloyd had ordered hundreds of wooden piles in preparation for stage 3. Javier stood atop the caisson, gripping a heavy wooden mallet as he relentlessly hammered the piles into place. The purpose was to reinforce the bottom of the caisson with friction posts that would stabilize the structure. While continuing the exhausting work, Javier asked when the next shipment of posts would arrive. Lloyd answered with a sly smile, casually remarking that the workers were already struggling to deliver them as quickly as possible. The suspicious expression on Lloyd's face immediately caught Javier's attention. He turned toward him and questioned the meaning behind that grin. Lloyd casually admitted that he had merely been surprised by how obedient Javier had become lately. Deep down, he found it especially amusing that Javier had not once complained about being a knight forced into manual labor. The moment Javier realized Lloyd was mocking him again, he silently dropped the hammer and began walking toward the exit. Lloyd instantly switched to an innocent expression and desperately called after him. He reminded Javier that as his escort knight, he should naturally help him. If the piles were not hammered in properly, Lloyd would fail to earn money. Without money, the family debts could never be repaid. If the stress caused Lloyd to collapse, then the Baron would become heartbroken. And if Lloyd ended up bedridden, even the Baroness might fall ill as well. Lloyd dramatically pleaded for Javier to protect his family like a true knight. Javier clearly saw through the shameless performance and remained entirely unconvinced. Even so, the ridiculous guilt trip still worked in the end. Without another word, he picked the hammer back up and resumed smashing the wooden piles into place. Meanwhile, Lloyd continued organizing the remaining stages of construction within his mind. After completing his usual coaching sessions with Javier, he intended to use Bangul's steel dung launcher to construct the steel framework. Once that was finished, they would finally pour the long-awaited cement. After the cement hardened completely, the caisson would be dismantled, leaving behind a completed artificial sea platform. Later, the workers carefully removed the outer structure of the caisson. The remaining sections were cut down according to the height of the hardened cement foundation. Lloyd explained that the completed platform stood 50 centimeters higher than the sea level during high tide. Because of that, placing the mermaid statue there would create the illusion that it was floating above the ocean. Count Cremo observed the structure with visible skepticism. Internally, he admitted that he still found the entire project difficult to believe. He questioned whether such a foundation could truly support the enormous weight of the statue. However, he also promised that if Lloyd succeeded, then the construction payment would greatly exceed expectations. In other words, Lloyd would need to remain in the city for some time to handle any potential repairs or problems that might appear. Privately, Lloyd decided to use the opportunity to rest for a few days. After all, it had already taken him 15 exhausting days to travel from his territory to Cremo in the first place. At long last, the gigantic mermaid statue was finally completed. That evening, the entire city celebrated with a grand completion ceremony. 6 sailboats had been docked beneath the towering statue along the shoreline, transforming the event into a lavish boat party. Naturally, both Lloyd and Javier received invitations as honored guests. To match the occasion, the two dressed in tuxedos they had purchased in the city. The moment Lloyd put the outfit on, discomfort spread all through him. He openly complained about how unbearably uncomfortable the formal clothes felt and questioned how anyone could tolerate wearing such things regularly. Javier calmly pointed out that Lloyd was acting as though it were his first time wearing formal attire, even though he clearly remembered him attending noble events dressed exactly like this in the past. Caught off guard, Lloyd awkwardly stumbled through an excuse, claiming that it had simply been a long time since he last wore such clothing. At that moment, Count Cremo loudly called for everyone's attention and proudly introduced the young man responsible for making the mermaid statue a reality. The crowd immediately burst into astonished murmurs as admiration spread among the guests. They praised the incredible work and quickly rushed forward in excitement. Unfortunately for Lloyd, every single person brushed right past him and surrounded Javier instead. The nobles endlessly admired Javier's flawless appearance and dignified presence while praising his talents with sparkling eyes. Some even nervously asked for the chance to shake his hand. Watching the entire scene unfold, Lloyd quietly suffered and sighed. Deep down, he had already expected this outcome from the beginning. He convinced himself that he was far smarter than most people there and repeatedly reminded himself that compliments meant nothing compared to fast money transfers. Even so, Javier's composed expression irritated him beyond belief. The more graceful Javier looked while receiving admiration, the more Lloyd wanted him to disappear from sight immediately. What irritated him most was the faintly sympathetic look Javier occasionally sent his way. Count Cremo suddenly burst into roaring laughter. The Count found the entire situation hilarious and mercilessly claimed that the whole problem came down to Lloyd's face. Within himself, Lloyd felt completely devastated. The Count's relentless follow-up attack struck him like a brutal two-hit combo. Still laughing, Count Cremo finally corrected the misunderstanding and formally announced to everyone that Lloyd himself was the true creator of the C platform. Shock instantly swept through the crowd once more. Confused murmurs spread everywhere as many admitted they had genuinely mistaken Lloyd for a servant. Meanwhile, far away from Cremo Port, violent waves crashed endlessly against the massive body of the Giga Titan. Towering tidal waves slammed directly into its enormous eyes, yet the creature did not even blink. Something deeply disturbing had entered its sight. A mermaid, and not only that, but an enormous mermaid unlike anything it had ever encountered before. The Giga Titan's tail twisted with visible disgust as memories of its own kind resurfaced. A humiliating past clawed through its thoughts. Once there had been a brutal war among its species, and it had ultimately failed to protect its territory against younger and stronger rivals. The shame of losing its domain still lingered heavily within it. A low growl escaped the creature. There was no longer any place for it to return to, yet now, in front of it, stood a solitary mermaid with no allies nearby. Several conclusions rapidly formed in its mind. First, this isolated mermaid appeared vulnerable enough to defeat alone. Second, she needed to be eliminated before she could summon others of her kind into the area. Having reached its decision, the Giga Titan prepared for battle. The monster submerged itself beneath the violently churning sea before charging forward at terrifying speed, propelling itself across the ocean floor. Back at the celebration, the hundreds of guests aboard the ships remained completely unaware of the danger rapidly approaching them. Javier suddenly paused mid-motion. The fruit drink inside his cup lightly trembled just before he raised it to drink. Without understanding why, his gaze slowly fixed itself straight ahead. His eyes narrowed sharply as a frown formed across his face. Lloyd immediately noticed Javier's strange posture and casually mocked him for standing stiffly like a statue. At the same time, he hurriedly clarified that he was not comparing him to some handsome Greek sculpture. However, Javier paid no attention whatsoever to the joke. Lloyd quickly realized he was being ignored and called out to him again. Javier finally answered, explaining that something was rapidly approaching their location. The uneasy tone instantly erased Lloyd's relaxed mood. He immediately demanded to know what exactly was coming toward them. Javier admitted that he could not identify it yet, but whatever it was, its speed was extraordinary. Lloyd then asked about its size. After focusing for a moment longer, Javier estimated that the approaching presence was roughly twice the size of the ship they stood on, perhaps even larger than Hamang at its maximum size. The answer sent a cold chill through Lloyd. Deep within, an ominous feeling swallowed him whole as dreadful images filled his mind. There was only one creature in these waters massive enough to fit that description, the Giga Titan. Lloyd immediately hurried toward Count Cremo and urgently called out to him. The Count casually greeted him and asked whether he was enjoying the party. Ignoring the question, Lloyd quickly leaned closer and quietly warned him that the Giga Titan appeared to be approaching. He insisted that they needed to alert the passengers and evacuate everyone immediately. The Count did not answer right away. Instead, his gaze shifted toward a sharp-looking middle-aged man standing nearby. Count Cremo asked Sir Genevieve whether he sensed anything unusual in the distant sea. Sir Genevieve calmly observed the waters before confidently stating that he detected nothing abnormal. The Count then reassured Lloyd by explaining that Sir Genevieve had nearly reached the level of a swordmaster, making his senses extraordinarily reliable. According to him, there was no reason to doubt that judgment. Inside, Lloyd almost exploded in frustration. Javier's senses were even sharper, and unlike anyone else present, Javier was practically the story's main character. Deep down, Lloyd desperately wondered how he was supposed to convince them. Count Cremo let out a relaxed chuckle and reminded Lloyd that the Giga Titan had never approached this closely in recent years. As far as he was concerned, there was no reason for the creature to suddenly attack now, but Lloyd's gaze slowly shifted toward the gigantic mermaid statue. Quietly, he pointed out that there might now be a very clear reason for the creature to appear. The Count stared at Lloyd in visible conflict, uncertain whether he should act or dismiss the warning entirely. Lloyd responded with a firm nod, unwavering conviction burning in his eyes. At that moment, Sir Genevieve suddenly interrupted. Though he did not understand the source of their concerns, his senses had finally begun detecting something strange approaching through the sea. The Count immediately stopped hesitating. Without wasting another second, he issued urgent orders to raise the anchors and move every ship away from the statue at once. Chaos instantly erupted across the boats as people shouted for everyone to hurry. Javier coldly remarked that the evacuation was taking far too long. Realizing they needed immediate action, Lloyd ordered Javier to deal with the anchor personally. Javier gave a silent nod before instantly leaping overboard. Drawing his sword mid-dive, he shot through the water toward the anchor at incredible speed. At the same time, Lloyd summoned Podong and hurled him high into the air. Podong spun like a flying frisbee before swallowing the red sunflower seed. His body rapidly expanded into gigantic proportions before crashing down onto the statue itself. In mere moments, he bit through the ropes binding the ships together and detached them completely. Meanwhile, Javier unleashed Mana Blast beneath the sea and sliced apart the anchor chain with a single strike. Freed from the restraints, the ship violently swayed before finally becoming ready to sail back toward the port. But Javier's instincts screamed relentlessly that the Giga Titan was already almost upon them, and those instincts proved correct. The Giga Titan accelerated even further beneath the sea and closed the remaining distance toward the ships in an instant. Realizing disaster was unavoidable, Lloyd immediately shouted for everyone to spread out and scatter away from one another. Then it happened. A colossal silhouette exploded upward from beneath the ocean with overwhelming force. The massive creature crashed directly into the 5 remaining boats surrounding the statue. The impact sent Lloyd flying helplessly through the air like a tiny pebble. At that same instant, Javier activated Mana Blast beneath the water and launched himself upward. He shot through the air toward Lloyd and caught him securely in his arms before he could fall into the sea. The Giga Titan tore through the raging waves and slammed its colossal head directly into the waist of the mermaid statue. The entire upper half of the statue broke apart and launched into the sky like a massive projectile fired from a catapult. It soared nearly a mile across the night sky above Cremo before crashing directly into the city plaza. The impact was catastrophic. Several tons of stone rained down violently upon the square. The pavement shattered instantly, the fountain was obliterated, and the broken remains of the statue bounced and rolled across the plaza before finally grinding to a halt near the edge. Meanwhile, chaos completely consumed the sea. People screamed desperately while struggling to stay afloat among the wreckage of the sinking ships. Standing atop a sinking boat, Lloyd clenched his teeth in frustration. Privately, he realized there was no possible way to save every single person trapped in the disaster. Then sudden realization struck him. Without hesitation, Lloyd summoned Hamang. Understanding the command immediately, Hamang plunged into the sea and activated one shot. Massive currents began spiraling violently into his mouth, and along with the seawater, countless drowning people were sucked safely into his enormous belly as his body continuously expanded larger and larger. At the same time, the Giga Titan lowered its massive body and surged toward the city, splitting apart the waves as it advanced toward land. Javier urgently shouted that the Giga Titan was heading directly for the city and insisted they needed to stop it immediately. But his words abruptly died in his throat. To his complete disbelief, Lloyd was already sailing away on a raft in the exact opposite direction. Javier shouted after him in shock, unable to comprehend why Lloyd was fleeing while the monster headed elsewhere. Lloyd immediately fired back that escaping was precisely why they needed to move in the opposite direction. He openly questioned whether Javier had completely lost his mind for even considering fighting such a monster. Javier stared in stunned silence, unable to believe Lloyd was genuinely attempting to abandon the battle and run away. Meanwhile, Hamang continued safely discharging rescued civilians onto nearby boats, while Count Cremo frantically ordered his men to escape as quickly as possible. Desperate cries still echoed across the sea as many victims remained stranded in the water. By then, however, the Giga Titan had already reached land and entered the city itself. Buildings crumbled instantly beneath its overwhelming size. Houses shattered apart as the monster rampaged through the streets, destroying everything along its path while terrified citizens fled for their lives. arrives. Lloyd impatiently shouted at Javier again, demanding that he stop standing there and hurry up already. Still unable to accept what he was hearing, Javier questioned whether Lloyd truly intended to ignore all the innocent people currently in danger. Lloyd bluntly answered that they had only come to Cremo to earn money, not to fight sea monsters or defend the city. According to him, Cremo already possessed an army, artillery, and every possible means of defense. The city would handle the problem on its own eventually. Javier fell into stunned silence. Inside, his thoughts spiraled violently. Until now, he had witnessed Lloyd display remarkable ingenuity during moments of crisis. He had seen Lloyd refuse to surrender and act decisively to help struggling people. But now, those impressions began collapsing before his eyes. Lloyd loudly continued insisting that they already had enough problems of their own and had no obligation to protect someone else's city. To him, running away was simply the most rational decision possible. Deep within, Javier finally came to a bitter conclusion. In the end, this was Lloyd Frontera's true nature after all. At that exact moment, the system notification appeared before Lloyd. Javier's approval rating toward him had decreased by 5 points. His relationship with an important character had worsened. Fortunately, however, no RP would be lost because of it. Javier suddenly unsheathed his blade and firmly declared that abandoning the city was something he could never do. Lloyd instantly exploded in anger. He shouted at Javier to stop acting righteous all the time and warned him that returning there would only get him killed. But Javier ignored the warning completely. He leaped out from the ship and planted his foot atop his sword. The moment Mana Blast activated beneath him, his body shot forward like a missile across the sea, racing directly toward the city. Along the coastline, rows of defensive posts had already begun firing. Massive culverins unleashed roaring flames as giant cannonballs tore through the air toward the Giga Titan. But the bombardment accomplished absolutely nothing. The cannonballs simply bounced and deflected harmlessly off the creature's shell without leaving even the slightest damage behind. The soldiers stared in horror, unable to comprehend how the monster had not even flinched from the direct hits. The Giga Titan answered with a deafening roar. Then it unleashed a devastating wave of water pressure powerful enough to completely blow apart the roofs of the coastal posts. Afterward, the monster's gaze hardened. At last, it had rediscovered the target it sought. The broken remains of the mermaid statue still lay scattered across the distant city plaza. To the Giga Titan, destroying that mermaid represented redemption itself. The creature trampled through buildings without hesitation and advanced straight toward the shattered statue while terrified civilians screamed beneath the collapsing destruction. Some were crushed directly under its enormous body as it moved forward relentlessly. At that moment, Javier finally arrived. Brandishing his sword, he activated Mana Blast and charged forward with explosive force. Flames engulfed the blade as he unleashed a full-powered strike directly against the Giga Titan's mandible. But the shell was monstrously durable. Javier's sword bounced straight back upon impact. Shock spread across Javier's face as he realized even his Mana Blast slice had failed to penetrate the creature's defense. Even so, the impact still caused the Giga Titan to wobble slightly before it lost balance and crashed into a nearby building. The monster roared furiously as it regained its footing and immediately lunged toward Javier. Javier barely managed to leap backward before the creature's mandible slammed into the ground directly before him. Then the Giga Titan narrowed its eyes and sprayed out a strange fluid. The substance mixed with the surrounding wind and shot forward at horrifying speed. Unable to evade the sudden attack, Javier desperately raised his sword to block it. The force proved overwhelming. Both his blade and body were violently blown backward as the impact sent him crashing through the air. He slammed brutally against a wall before collapsing onto the ground below. Blood dripped from the corner of Javier's lips as he gritted his teeth in pain. Using his sword for support, he slowly forced himself back onto his feet. Deep within, Javier accepted the reality before him. He knew he could never truly defeat a monster of this level. He even understood that he might die there. Even so, he refused to fall before buying enough time for the civilians to escape safely. Meanwhile, Lloyd continued desperately paddling his raft away from the city while breathing heavily. Within himself, he bitterly reminded himself that he was not some overwhelmingly powerful protagonist. Even with RP, all of his abilities revolved around construction work. There was nothing he could realistically do against a monster like that. He was human too, and naturally it hurt to watch the city collapse and innocent people suffer. But then his thoughts suddenly caught on one point. The city gets destroyed. People get hurt. Lloyd slowly stopped paddling. Guilt churned violently inside him as the thought repeated over and over in his mind. If he truly abandoned the city like this, then everything would certainly be destroyed. At last, Lloyd reached a conclusion. This was no longer the time to run away. It was time to fight. After all, if the city got destroyed, then their construction fee payments would be delayed. Instantly turning the raft back toward the coast, Lloyd shouted for Bangul to head back with him. Bangul enthusiastically cried out in response. After swallowing the sunflower seed, Bangul's body rapidly expanded to gigantic proportions. Lloyd climbed atop her head, and the moment volcanic blast activated, Bangul launched forward like a living rocket toward the coastline. With fury blazing across his face, Lloyd screamed that the damned oversized lobster was finished. With a deafening roar, Javier charged forward once again. The Giga Titan answered with its own monstrous roar as it met his assault head on. Within his mind, Javier rapidly analyzed the creature. No matter how monstrous it appeared, it was still ultimately an animal, which meant its eyes had to be vulnerable. The moment Monoblast activated, Javier lunged straight toward the Giga Titan's eye and drove his flaming sword directly into it. Even then, the attack barely managed to scratch the surface. Still, the sudden strike distracted the monster long enough. Lloyd instantly seized the opening and shouted for Homang to begin hammer time. The giant hippo launched high into the air before plummeting downward like a torpedo. The impact slammed directly into the Giga Titan and hurled its massive body backward through the streets before it crashed violently into another building. After the attack, Homang rapidly shrank back down as huge amounts of water spilled from his mouth. His exhausted body flopped through the air and landed squarely on top of Lloyd's head. Furious, Lloyd gripped his shovel tightly while raging over the monster threatening his cash flow. At the same time, Javier immediately charged again, flames exploding from his sword as he rushed toward the Giga Titan. His blade struck the creature's eye with full force. A loud metallic shockwave burst outward as the collision sent powerful waves rippling through the surroundings. Javier froze in disbelief. He could not understand how the shell remained impenetrable even at its apparent weak point. Inside, frustration and confusion rapidly built within him. He had initially believed victory might still be possible, but now he could no longer see any path toward defeating the monster. Yet strangely, despite the hopeless situation, calmness spread through him instead. The reason became immediately clear to him. Lloyd had come back. To Javier, Lloyd returning to the battlefield itself meant there had to be a way to win. 2.5 minutes earlier, after reaching the coastline, Lloyd had immediately jumped off Bangul and mounted Padong instead. The giant hamster dashed through the devastated city like a dark horse, rapidly bouncing across rooftops while carrying Lloyd closer to the battlefield. Lloyd repeatedly ordered Padong not to approach too closely, and instead circle around the Giga Titan carefully so the monster would fail to notice them. Determined, Padong nodded and sped around the battlefield at incredible speed, while Javier continued fighting in the center. Meanwhile, Lloyd desperately searched for the creature's weak point. Internally, his thoughts raced wildly. Javier's Mana Blast had proven completely ineffective, which meant the creature's structure itself had to be abnormally durable. That realization immediately led Lloyd toward another line of thinking. What exactly was the shell made of? The instant that thought surfaced, realization struck him. Without hesitation, Lloyd activated Survey. Excitement spread across his face as the Giga Titan's entire body instantly transformed into layers of augmented data before his eyes. Every section he observed became scanned, analyzed, and broken down into structural information. A grin slowly spread across Lloyd's face. After all, even living creatures were still made of physical materials. That meant they could be surveyed, just like buildings or structures. The analysis rapidly revealed the composition of the shell. It consisted of an enormous combination of dentin and chitin nearly 1 meter thick. At the molecular level, the shell possessed an incredibly dense triple-layer honeycomb structure tightly woven together like state-of-the-art armor plating. Lloyd's gaze sharpened further. One particular detail immediately caught his attention. The Giga Titan's horn was not decorative at all. Strange wave patterns continuously concentrated around it, while the inside remained hollow. Lloyd's eyes locked onto another precise location nearby, where a water sac connected to the creature's hydraulic claw system. If Javier struck that exact point from the proper angle with Mana Blast, the structure could finally be destroyed. Javier looked toward Lloyd and urgently demanded to know what they were supposed to do next. Instead of answering normally, Lloyd suddenly struck a bizarre pose. He pointed a single finger above his head, then raised 2 fingers with his other hand before making a slashing motion. Javier stared at him in complete confusion and shouted back, wondering whether Lloyd had completely lost control of himself. Furious, Lloyd immediately yelled the actual explanation at the top of his lungs. The target was the horn. Javier needed to cut off the Giga Titan's horn. Without another word, Javier launched himself upward in a swift acrobatic leap before landing directly atop the Giga Titan's head. Deep within, Javier understood that merely severing the horn would not normally be fatal to such a monster. Even so, one thought firmly remained in his mind. Lloyd would never confidently give instructions unless he truly believed they could work. With a powerful battle cry, Javier burst forward at tremendous speed. He continuously shifted direction mid-air while rapidly closing the distance toward the horn. At that moment, Lloyd shouted another warning. Even though the horn was hollow inside, simply striking it with brute force would not cut through it easily. Mana circles were not just about hitting harder. After reaching the top of the horn, Javier immediately demanded to know what exactly he was supposed to do instead. Lloyd shouted back that the attack needed to be fast rather than overwhelmingly powerful. It had to strike with lightning-like speed. Javier bitterly realized that accomplishing something like that was far easier said than done. Still, he moved instantly. Like a violent gust of wind, Javier accelerated forward. Before the Giga Titan could violently shake him off, he leaped into the air and poured his mana directly into the sword. At the same time, he twisted his body sharply to the right mid-air, adding rotational force into the strike itself. Then he swung. His blade flashed coldly through the air before digging directly into the horn. Watching the attack connect, Lloyd clenched his fist in excitement. The theory had actually worked. Javier had successfully created something akin to a high-frequency mana chainsaw through rapid vibration and rotational force. Lloyd had only theorized it was possible, but he had trusted Javier could accomplish it. Javier roared with everything he had as he forced the blade deeper into the horn. The Giga Titan shrieked in agony and wildly swung its massive mandibles toward Javier in an attempt to stop him. At that exact moment, Lloyd gave Padong another command. Responding immediately, Padong launched high into the air and smashed directly onto the Giga Titan's mandible like a giant hammer. Then the decisive moment arrived. A sharp slash echoed across the battlefield as the horn finally cracked apart and tore free from the Giga Titan's forehead. The monster unleashed a horrifying scream of pain while enormous amounts of fluid violently sprayed out from the shattered horn. The instant Lloyd saw it happen, he immediately shouted another instruction toward Javier. He directed him toward the precise area located between the creature's middle legs. The attack needed to travel from the direction of the tail toward the head at an angle. If Javier successfully landed a Mana Blast strike through that exact line, then their construction repayments would not be delayed. Following Lloyd's instructions exactly, Javier sprinted directly beneath the Giga Titan. He slid to a halt and positioned himself precisely at the creature's center. At once, Javier forced his mana circles into violent collision and pointed his sword upward. Mana Blast began gathering at the blade. Clenching his teeth, Javier resolved himself completely. If this attack failed, then both he and the Giga Titan would die together. But just before the blast could pierce the creature's weak point, Padong suddenly dashed forward. In the next instant, the Giga Titan's colossal body came crashing downward toward Javier. His sword was violently knocked from his grasp and slid far across the ground as the monster nearly crushed him beneath its weight. Horror instantly spread across Lloyd's face as he screamed Javier's name in disbelief. Then, at the very last possible moment, Padong shot forward like a bolt of lightning. The giant hamster clamped Javier safely within his jaws and escaped mere moments before the Giga Titan's body slammed fully into the ground. Relief immediately flooded Lloyd as he clenched his fist and praised Padong's perfectly timed rescue. Meanwhile, Padong loudly scolded Javier while continuously chattering at him. Javier calmly apologized to Master Padong, despite not understanding a single word being said. Even so, he quietly assumed Padong was reprimanding him for his reckless behavior. After retrieving his sword, Javier firmly declared that he would survive long enough to defeat the monster. This time, he would fully trust Lloyd's plans. Meanwhile, Lloyd rapidly organized his thoughts. After successfully surveying the Giga Titan earlier, he had developed Plan D. Implementing it had proven extremely difficult because the creature was far faster than anticipated, but now there was no no other choice. They had to carry Plan D through to the very end. According to Lloyd, combining Plan A and Plan D together was now their only chance of defeating the monster permanently. Calling out to Podong, Lloyd summoned him over immediately. Podong quickly leaped upward to the elevated spot where Lloyd stood waiting. Mounting the giant hamster, Lloyd ordered him to head toward the location he had previously mentioned. Podong enthusiastically acknowledged the command. Lloyd then shouted toward Javier and explained that the Giga Titan now viewed him as the greatest threat on the battlefield. Because of that, Javier needed to lure the creature along the eastern coastline and into the woods. Javier immediately accepted the order without hesitation. As Lloyd sped away atop Podong, determination hardened inside him. They had already bought enough time by now. Everything should have been completed already. Deep down, Lloyd placed all his hopes on Count Cremo. 15 minutes earlier, Count Cremo had watched helplessly as the Giga Titan crawled through the city, leaving destruction everywhere in its path. Overwhelmed with despair, the Count struggled to believe such a catastrophe was truly happening before his eyes. One of his knights apologized bitterly, blaming himself for failing to detect the monster sooner. But Count Cremo shook his head while clutching it in frustration. He admitted that the fault rested with him alone. He had grown complacent and foolishly believed that a mere statue could truly drive away such a beast. At that exact moment, Lloyd suddenly appeared riding atop Bangle. Immediately, Lloyd rejected the Count's hopeless conclusion. According to him, the statue truly could drive the Giga Titan away. Relief briefly crossed Count Cremo's face after realizing Lloyd had survived. Lloyd quickly explained his reasoning. The Giga Titan had clearly come ashore to destroy the mermaid statue completely. That obsession was exactly what they intended to exploit. He then informed the Count that while he and Javier bought time against the monster, Count Cremo needed to focus on one critical task above all else. The shattered mermaid statue had to be reconstructed immediately. Meanwhile, the Giga Titan launched itself forward and relentlessly chased after Javier exactly as Lloyd had planned. The creature rapidly closed the distance before violently slamming its massive mandibles downward. Javier barely escaped the strike by a fraction of a second as he leaped aside. Breathing heavily, Javier felt his body reaching its absolute limit. Deep down, he knew he could not continue much longer. Even so, he gritted his teeth and forced himself onward. Quitting now was not an option. Turning forward once more, Javier continued running. At first, he reminded himself that his mission was simply to lure the creature away, but soon that purpose changed within him. It was no longer just for the city itself, it was for the people living inside it. Behind him, explosive sounds erupted repeatedly as the Giga Titan tore through entire sections of land with single devastating strikes. Javier sprinted desperately despite his completely exhausted body. His stamina had already been pushed beyond its limits, yet he still continued running while the Giga Titan drew closer and closer behind him. Then suddenly, Lloyd's voice exploded across the battlefield at full volume. He loudly introduced the arrival of the one and only bronze statue. Javier abruptly halted and stared ahead in stunned disbelief. A cart rattled violently across the ground at incredible speed. The Giga Titan instantly stopped chasing Javier and turned toward the approaching sight. The reconstructed mermaid statue swayed wildly atop the cart, its repaired joints dangling loosely like a giant nunchuck. And standing proudly at the front was Lloyd himself, grinning in delight while driving it forward. The moment Javier saw it, realization struck him immediately. The statue had been carefully tilted upright and firmly tied to the cart using thick ropes. Additional ropes connected the cart loosely around Podong's waist, allowing the giant hamster to pull everything behind him like a wild galloping horse. Meanwhile, Lloyd loudly mocked the Giga Titan while presenting the reconstructed mermaid as the creature's true enemy. The Giga Titan instantly reacted. The moment its eyes landed on the statue, everything else vanished from its focus. Javier was completely forgotten. To the monster, only the mermaid remained, the hated nemesis it desperately wished to destroy. Watching the reaction, satisfaction spread through Lloyd. Internally, he praised both the reconstruction effort and Count Cremo's reliability. Thanks to what he knew from the original story, he had trusted the Count could restore the statue in time. Lloyd then shouted toward Javier and announced that he would create an opening for the attack. Completely exhausted, Javier complained that Lloyd should explain the entire plan beforehand next time instead of making him figure it out halfway through battle. Lloyd immediately slapped Podong's back and shouted for more speed, while insisting there absolutely should not be a next time. Podong enthusiastically accelerated. As the cart thundered across the terrain, the loosely connected mermaid statue began wildly swinging around in every direction. The bizarre movement made it look as though the giant statue was performing some kind of chaotic hip-hop dance. chance. The sight instantly provoked the Giga Titan into charging directly toward it. Realizing the distraction had fully succeeded, Lloyd hurriedly shouted for Padong to run even faster, while urgently reminding Javier to finish the job already. Everything had finally been prepared. The Giga Titan's attention now belonged entirely to the statue, and that meant it was finally Javier's chance to kill the monster. Javier shot through the air like a bolt of lightning. Completely focused on chasing Padong and the reconstructed mermaid statue, the Giga Titan had left itself defenseless for a brief moment. Javier seized that opening instantly. Clutching his longsword tightly, he charged straight toward the creature's weak point. The moment he reached the correct position, he thrust upward before slashing downward at blinding speed. Then his ultimate technique exploded forth. Mana Blast erupted violently. A massive destructive force swirled deep between the Giga Titan's carapace, tearing apart everything caught within the blast radius. The shockwave shredded through layers of shell and dug directly inward. The Giga Titan unleashed a horrifying screech while its gigantic body writhed violently in agony, but the penetrating force soon faded. In the next instant, Javier's body was struck by the sheer power of the creature's forearm. Even a mere glancing blow launched him violently through the air like a projectile. Shock spread across Javier's face. As his body descended helplessly, bitter realization filled him. Despite pouring everything into the attack, he had managed to crack only a small opening in the outer shell. Part of him tried blaming the countless mana blasts he had already used, but deep within, he rejected the excuse immediately. The truth was simple. He was still too weak to fully protect the people depending on him. Then suddenly, Lloyd's voice echoed powerfully through his fading consciousness. Lloyd praised him for succeeding and confidently declared that the rest could now be left to him. Within his fading thoughts, Javier reflected on those words. He had exhausted every remaining ounce of strength in that final mana blast, and his consciousness was already slipping away. Yet, strangely, calmness spread through him once again, because Lloyd had spoken with complete certainty. At that moment, Hamang rolled rapidly across the rocky ground like a giant ball. He stopped precisely beneath Javier's falling body, safely catching him on his back before immediately carrying him away from the Giga Titan's sight. Meanwhile, Lloyd loudly promised Javier that he would protect the city no matter what. But privately, Lloyd admitted the brutal truth to himself. He did not actually believe victory was guaranteed. At best, he might be able to lure the Giga Titan far away from Cremo, but even then, there was no assurance the creature would not eventually return. After all, the waters surrounding Cremo were already its natural habitat. Worse still, the monster was intelligent enough to possibly seek revenge for the mermaid statue incident. Still, there was no time left for hesitation. Lloyd urged Padong to keep moving faster, but even Padong had begun panting heavily from exhaustion. The sight caused Lloyd's heart to sink. Padong had already reached his absolute limit as well. Lloyd knew he could not push him any further. At last, Lloyd decisively gave the command. Instantly, Padong dug all 4 feet into the ground and screeched to a violent halt. The sudden stop launched Lloyd directly through the air toward the Giga Titan's exposed core while he tightly gripped his shovel. As he flew forward, Lloyd desperately searched his mind for one thing he could absolutely accomplish right now. Earlier, when he had resolved to save the city and secure a proper return on his investment, he had already devised several plans involving direct combat. All of those plans required one thing: Mana Blast. Lloyd needed to perform a Mana Blast himself, but there was a problem. Using Mana Blast required a triple heart circle, while Lloyd currently possessed only a double heart circle. Then Lloyd reached a decision. If he lacked a triple circle, then he would simply create one right there. He still possessed enough RP to attempt it. Determined, Lloyd opened the skill menu in mid-air. The Asrahan core technique appeared before him, the same skill he had created inside the Dark Ant Cave, the technique that had once driven him into complete despair. Now, the time had finally come to evolve it into a triple circle technique. The skill information materialized before his eyes. The required RP cost was enormous. Leveling it further demanded a staggering amount of points, but Lloyd no longer had any other choice. Without hesitation, he selected the upgrade option. The Asrahan core technique immediately began leveling up at rapid speed. Level 5. Then 6, 7, 8, 9. At last, the technique reached its limit. To upgrade the technique to level 10, Lloyd needed 370 RP. But he only had 311 remaining. Frustration exploded through him instantly. Deep down, he bitterly realized there was nothing more he could do now. Rationally, he should have stayed far away from the battle from the very beginning. and yet somehow he was currently dangling directly from the Giga Titan's carapace. Panic flooded his thoughts as he questioned what exactly he was even doing there. Part of him desperately considered simply gathering mana and stabbing into the creature with the shovel. Even the slightest crack would allow him to dig deeper into the weak spot somehow. But none of that mattered right now. What he truly needed was more RP immediately. Lloyd frantically searched for any possible solution inside his head. Then suddenly, system notifications appeared before his eyes. Javier's approval rating toward him had increased by 4 points. His current RP had risen to 391. Excitement instantly surged through Lloyd. Now it was possible. Without wasting even a second, Lloyd opened the skill window and spent the RP immediately. At last, the message he had desperately waited for appeared before him. The Azrahan core technique had successfully evolved into Triple Circle level 1, amplifying his mana output by 500%. Lloyd immediately tightened his grip around the shovel and shouted fiercely at the Giga Titan. One circle existed to protect the heart, while the remaining 2 circles... Before he could finish, the Giga Titan unleashed a violent roar and smashed the surrounding rocks apart. Massive stone fragments exploded into the air like deadly projectiles. Lloyd prepared to unleash Mana Blast while raising his shovel, but then something struck him. A massive impact slammed directly into his head. His vision violently shook as blood sprayed outward from the blow. The force nearly ripped him away from the carapace entirely. Lloyd's grip immediately began slipping. Disoriented, he struggled to understand what had even hit him. Deep within his fading consciousness, only one thought remained. He still needed to land one perfect strike. One circle protects the... But his thoughts suddenly became fragmented. Confusion swallowed him as consciousness rapidly faded away. He repeatedly muttered about the circles without fully understanding what he was trying to do anymore. Still, instinct continued moving his body. The 3 heart circles rapidly drew together while violently resonating against one another. Then something changed. There was no longer a single circle protecting the others. All 3 circles collided together at once. At that exact moment, while losing consciousness completely, Lloyd's body instinctively extended the metal shovel forward exactly as muscle memory remembered. Then it happened. A massive destructive force exploded outward with a deafening blast. The attack pierced directly into the Giga Titan's weak point and tore through the muscles and internal organs hidden beneath the shell. For the very first time in history, a triple mana blast had been unleashed. An overwhelming torrent of violent fire burst completely through the monster's body. Flesh and shattered internal organs exploded outward like grotesque fireworks, while the mana blast continued tearing through everything in its path. For the first time ever, the Giga Titan released a true scream of agony. Its enormous body was completely penetrated in a single strike. Then everything began falling. Shredded remains rained down from the sky together with Lloyd's unconscious body. As he plummeted toward the ground, numbness spread through his mind until everything around him began feeling distant and dreamlike. His vague eyes stared blankly ahead while consciousness slipped further away. Meanwhile, all 3 summons gathered around Javier and anxiously attempted to wake him up. Slowly, Javier emerged from unconsciousness and opened his hazy eyes. The first thing he saw was Padong, Hamang, and the others standing safely nearby. Relief quietly spread through him after realizing they had survived. Then his gaze shifted toward the Giga Titan's ruined corpse. Stunned disbelief filled him immediately. Lloyd had truly accomplished exactly what he claimed he would do, yet Javier could not even begin to understand how Lloyd had managed to pull it off. At that moment, Padong suddenly began jumping around frantically, desperately trying to draw Javier's attention somewhere else. Javier looked toward Padong in confusion and asked what he was trying to show him. Quietly, he wondered whether Padong wanted him to follow. Immediately, all 3 summons began running ahead together, guiding Javier toward a specific location. Javier followed without hesitation, but the moment he arrived, his steps came to a complete halt. Shock froze his entire body. Lloyd lay motionless on the ground with his eyes still open while blood slowly streamed down from his head. Panic instantly overtook Javier as he rushed forward and desperately called out to him. He repeatedly shouted Lloyd's name, but no response came back. Without wasting another second, Javier quickly bent down and checked Lloyd's heartbeat. Then overwhelming shock swallowed him whole. Lloyd's heart had stopped beating entirely, yet inside Lloyd's body something strange was happening. Something unprecedented, something miraculous. Thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe if you enjoyed it. Until next time, happy watching.